What's up, you guys? We have a Dr. Sean Baker, the guy who coined the name Carnivore Diet and is leading the charge in helping thousands with their health via the Carnivore Diet, against Dr. Garth Davis, who is the guy in the plant-based space who is leading the charge helping thousands of people with a plant-based diet, though he subscribes to a vegan diet himself. Now, obviously, in creating this debate and this conversation, I really wanted to find somebody who was of the same caliber level as Dr. Sean Baker and somebody who was as well respected in their community. And that is...
I hope not. That's a little rude. No need for the shade.
Dr. Garth Davis. So these are two Goliath characters who are going back to back specifically with science so that we can unravel the truth. And Sean even actually opens up about something on camera that he's never really even said before, I don't believe, on camera, which I think is very interesting and important. But overall, we go through about 4 different topics, which include things like, is fiber necessary? Is the news media bought and owned by a plant-based narrative? Is meat causing inflammation or early death or cancer?
I wish we see so much anti-plant-based slop in the media. The fiber stuff we read a little bit about last night, so they'll be interesting to see Sean Baker representing that view here. We learned last night that fiber is not an essential nutrient on a narrow nutrition science definition, which is that we can't synthesize it and it will cause a specific deficiency disease if we don't have it. And while there's no specific fiber deficiency disease associated, or deficiency disease associated with lack of fiber is associated with increased risk of heart disease and early mortality. And so there has been some people arguing that it should correctly be reclassified as an essential nutrient. But we'll see how that plays out here.
Cancer, things like that. And overall, is there a common enemy that, with all of this confusing information out there and all of this...
Yo Po, yo Jake, hey Bretta, how's it going? Okay, yeah, I don't know who this person is who's hosting the debate. I don't know what Shafi is either, honestly. Might be out of the loop on that one.
This mixed bag of info and opposing views, the two of them can agree on. So I hope you guys like this video. As always, like and subscribe. The bigger subscriber base that we have, the bigger...
True, like and subscribe.
Guests on that I can have, and the closer we get to unraveling the truth. I hope you guys like this one. Let's get into it. Guys, I'm super excited to have you both on here. Dr. Garth Davis, Dr. Sean Baker. Excited to have both of you chat with me about the lifestyles and the diets that you promote for people to live the happiest, healthiest lifestyles that they can, avoid disease, and hopefully have the best life possible. So today's conversation, I have my intention is to explain why we want to do this in the first place. And it's also very fair for me to state my bias. So I am biased towards more of a meat-based lifestyle. I do coach people on that. But the point of having a conversation...
Okay, good to know. So this is a pro animal-based diet person. That's some detectives in chat knew about this already.
Like this is because I do think that there are so many echo chambers out there, and I do think that people lack information because of that. And I want to constantly challenge my beliefs and my understanding of science. And I think that's the point of science, is to get 2 experts in the field, possibly with opposing views, communicating with one another, because the whole point is to have open conversations so we can help people. So I'm absolutely down to have my opinions, my beliefs challenged. That's what we're doing. Why don't you go first, Garth, and go ahead and explain why you're here, why you're credible for this conversation, if you would, please.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Lauren. So my name is Garth Davis. I am a board certified weight loss surgeon and medical weight loss specialist, run several different clinics, and I'm currently the medical director for the Center for Weight Management.
What's up, Soy Daddy? Okay, Jake, good to know. All right, well, that's fair play, though. She disclosed her bias up front. I like that she said, I'm up for having my views challenged. It's as if she thought about saying changed, but then thought, well, I don't know about that.
Management at the Methodist Hospital in Houston, where I participate in research and medical and surgical management of obesity. Been studying nutrition and obesity for 20 plus years. Have treated thousands and thousands of patients. Wrote a book somewhat based on my experience and looking very critically at the literature called Proteinaholic. I've also written a book called The Expert's Guide to Weight Loss Surgery, though that's probably not pertinent with this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you. And what about you, Sean?
Yeah, so my background, I was a board certified orthopedic surgeon. I got interested in nutrition part due to my own personal experience with declining health as I got into my 40s. Sort of was, I guess, lured into the low carb space based on my own experience, and then looking at that, I wrote a book called The Carnivore Diet, which obviously advocates for a meat-based diet. I am a chief medical officer and co-founder of a company, Rivero. We are licensed in all 50 states, and our focus is, again, helping people to hopefully use a lifestyle to reverse disease. It's not an exclusive carnivore company, by the way. We use various different dietary and nutritional strategies. Our intention is to publish a lot of clinical research on this. I've been behind the scenes helping to organize studies around this because there's a dearth of studies on this particular cohort of people. I think most of the data that we have, just doesn't really reflect what's going on with this kind of unique and, burgeoning growing population. And so that's sort of my sort of bias. And I've been an athlete my whole life. I've been able to compete at a very high level, breaking numerous world records as an athlete. So I have a appreciation for the benefits of exercise on top of just diet. And like I said, I applaud Garth in at least addressing lifestyle as a very important thing, because I think it's underaddressed in the modern healthcare system. And it's challenging, and it's challenging for any physician to do that. As a busy surgeon, it's hard to have lifestyle discussions. We're not set up for that. Our system is really broken in a lot of ways. I mean, we're good at a lot of things, but we do a really poor job when it comes to management of chronic disease in general.
Yeah.
So if you have your medical license revoked, can you just carry on introducing yourself as I was a board certified medical practitioner? I guess you can, right? He was. That is true. There's no law, I guess, that says that you have to disclose that this is a past tense exclusively and now he's had the license revoked. I mean, I suppose what are they going to do at this point? Right? If you're misrepresenting your credentials as part of a certifying body, presumably the only real stick that they have to hit you with is to revoke your license. But if you already had your license revoked, you can say what you want now, right?
Yeah, it's so just so everybody's clear too, Sean, you're promoting more of a carnivore-based lifestyle. I know you're open to other lifestyles, kind of like you mentioned, but more or less that's kind of what you promote, meat-heavy diet for most health. And then Dr. Garth Davis, you promote more of a plant-based lifestyle. I believe you are vegan, but I believe you've been very clear about you don't promote veganism for health necessarily. Now, I could be wrong about that.
Very correct. That's a very important distinction. Yeah. So I promote a healthy plant-based diet for patients that is not exclusively vegan or vegetarian. It does not withhold all meat. So I never tell my patients you have to be vegan. And the amount of meat we recommend can vary, but it's going to be far lower, obviously, than what Sean recommends. But I don't say you have to be vegan to be healthy. I can make arguments as to why I think vegan is extremely healthy, but based on a lot of data, but that's not what I teach. But I am personally, I've been vegan 15 years, kind of like Sean. I was 35 and went to get my life insurance policy test because I was about to have a kid, and I completely and utterly failed it. My LDL cholesterol was 195, my triglycerides were sky high, I had fatty liver, I was about 20 pounds heavier than I am now, not at all athletic, and I sat back and said, what has my medical school taught me about this, and realized that it taught me nothing. And so I went absolutely crazy studying the literature and feeling a little bit like, what am I doing with my patients? I saw a patient the other day, morbidly obese, saw her doctor, and I had the doctor's note, and he puts down there as one of her diagnoses, obesity, and then he put plan. I told her to eat less and move more. obviously that's not the answer. And so I went looking, and I'm still looking for the answer because it's not so
Yeah.
simple as I think we'll probably find out.
If that were working, it would have worked already, right? So it's not quite there. Where
Well, hold on. Is that not the answer for dealing with obesity? Eat less and move more? That seems like pretty good advice now. And it's just saying that people don't take that advice, which I guess a lot of people don't. But yeah, that's pretty much if you're obese, that'd be my advice at least.
where I think we should kind of go next is the rules of the conversation. I'm going to put out a question. I'm going to call out who's to answer it first. You get probably let's just give it within 3 minutes to state that, so it's not a huge tangential thing. Next person can do the same, and then we'll just have an open conversation. I have 4 questions, which I think are pretty juicy topics really for the plant-based and the carnivore space. I've done this a couple times with different doctors on, Dr. Chafee, Dr. Ovadia, Dr. Khan, all being parts of this. So this will be pretty fun, and I think pretty straightforward. I encourage you both to speak as candidly as possible, because honestly, there's a lot of opinions about each other's sides that is said in private, but not necessarily as direct. And I think that's important to understanding truth. So whatever that may be, just, being as authentic as we can in it. So without any further ado,
I don't think you're going to have to worry about us two being.
I don't think I will
being candid.
It's funny because when I actually was looking for somebody to have a conversation with the both of you guys, I got some assistance from a friend of mine who is vegan. He's a proponent of this vegan lifestyle, and Sean is very well known in the space. Carnivore space. He actually coined the term carnivore diet himself. But then, I wanted somebody who was kind of up to his standard, at least in our space, with the carnivore space. And you, Dr. Davis, were the name. So you guys are both very well known in your spaces. So you're kind of leading the charges here. Let's be about it and make sure that we have clarity by the end of this. Okay, so the first question that I wanted to ask, I'm very curious about this. Does meat cause harm via, for example, saturated fat, or causes inflammation and high cholesterol? So realistically, those are the causes of eating meat that a lot of people say, but does meat cause harm for the longevity and the best lifestyle that one could have? And why don't you go ahead and start this, Garth?
The causes of eating meat. That's I'm sure that's not what you meant to say. This is what we have read in the evidence. That is yes, basically, is the short answer. And again, we were looking last night we were really looking hard for any evidence that supports the animal-based diet from a health perspective. We gave it a good go. And unfortunately, it looks like the evidence is just very weak for that. So, yeah, let's see where they go with it. But short answer, yes, to question 1.
This is a very complicated question, so it is not so simple as saying, does meat cause harm? Is meat the reason?
True, Jake. Thank you for the reminder. Yeah, hit like, give us a follow, give us, all the things, boost us in the algo.
That we have a lower life expectancy than other countries because we eat more meat? No, it's much more complicated than that. There's so many different things that go into a diet. Do I think meat is a healthy part of a diet? No, I don't. But you have to break down meat into what are the different components of meat. So there are multiple different things. We could have unprocessed meat, we could have processed meat, we could have red meat, we could have white meat, we could have fish, depending on whether or not you think that's meat. In order to study this, you got to understand there are different variables that we need to look at. Are we looking at momentary changes that extrapolate to lifelong health? In other words, does it just increase LDL cholesterol, and does increasing LDL cholesterol then mean increased cardiovascular mortality? I think what we really need to know, what we really want to know is, does meat associate it with all-cause mortality? Does it associate with cancer? Does it associate with cardiac mortality, which is our leading cause of death? And are those associations good associations? In other words, is the research very strong for those? got a whole bunch of papers laying on this table that I could pull out for you if we want to go into the details. Let's start at this. In order to understand whether meat is a topic that is causing a shortened lifespan, we have to be able to follow people for a long period of time that have been on the diet. Preferably, we would want to follow them from birth, have one group eating meat and one group not eating meat. That's very difficult to do, right? Having a short-term study of 5 years, how are you going to make an inference really on whether this is affecting cardiac mortality or long-term mortality on cancer? You really need long-term studies. If we're going to look at long-term studies of meat consumption, we're going to have to look at some epidemiology that have followed people for long-term. Now, what people need to understand is in order to follow someone long-term and have a good study about it, you need a prospective cohort. In other words, we need to start collecting people and we need to study them for an extended period of time. We need to show that one group is eating a lot of meat versus one group not eating a lot of meat. So if you have two groups that are eating similar amounts of meat, it's hard to draw any statistical correlations. We have to have a mechanism of why we think this works, and then we have to have some long-term results. There have been several studies like this. My favorite study to bring up in this situation is called the Adventist Health Study. I bring this up because the Adventist health population is a very interesting population. It is a population that they started looking at in the Adventist Health 1 study in Loma Linda, California. Now, the interesting thing is Loma Linda, California is surrounded by a whole bunch of areas with very low life expectancy. The study initially was done looking at tobacco's effect on lifespan, and what they found is that the people in Loma Linda, California didn't smoke, and they also had an amazingly extended lifespan compared to the other populations around there. So they started following Adventists for a long period of time. The beauty of it, heterogeneity in the actual people. They didn't have the same genetics. This isn't like we're studying someone from Okinawa that everybody has the same genetics. It's a bunch of different people. They're all in the same environment. So it's not like we can't say, oh, one's, associated with pollution or something else. And they have a very healthy lifestyle. They don't drink, they don't smoke. And when you follow them out long term, the only thing that seems to be different is that some groups eat meat, although they eat less than the rest of the country. Some groups eat a light amount of meat. Some groups eat dairy, they're lacto-ovo. Some groups are pescatarian and some are actually vegan. And in fact, they've got the largest vegan population in the entire world.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. Common criticism of epidemiology, which is this kind of cohort study he's talking about, where you follow a large group of people over a long time, and you can look at their different diets and the health outcomes that they're associated with over a long period of time. One common criticism of that is that it doesn't control for other factors. And so people will say, even if there's epidemiological evidence that vegan diets are associated with better health outcomes, you can't necessarily say that that's causal, because there could be other things that are going on with the vegan group. For example, maybe people who are vegan are very concerned with their health in general, and therefore maybe vegans are less likely to drink and less likely to smoke and more likely to do exercise and things like this. So it's kind of confounding. But he's saying here, he's saying here that you have a population where that's not the case, right? There's generally everybody in this population, including the vegans and the meat eaters, are healthy in these other respects of not drinking, not smoking, and so on. And so essentially a lot of those potential confounds are controlled for here, because nobody in this cohort is drinking or smoking. So that's interesting to note. I'm noting down on the other tab these talking points for the Mount Actung debate, because it's good to... this is a good way of getting to grips with what the evidence is on either side. It always kind of makes me laugh as well. Why would... It's a peculiar assumption, if a vegan diet is not healthier, that, people following a vegan diet are probably generally concerned with their health. It's like, okay, well, doesn't that suggest that they've probably done some amount of research and concluded that a vegan diet is healthier? if you have these people who are very concerned with their health and therefore they're not drinking and not smoking and so on, and those people are more likely to choose a vegan diet, that's also kind of telling you something, right? Now, of course, what we want to do is isolate the effect of the diet and not have those confounds, which he's saying in this cohort you can, so worth noting. But yeah, that healthy user bias that's called. And yeah, I think there's like an assumption that a vegan diet is a healthy lifestyle kind of built into that criticism. So yeah, I've always found that a little bit funny.
This group has been studied now very long term, over 100,000 people, and they've got a very interesting correlation. No matter what you look at, in order to say something correlates, you want to know it's in a dose dependent fashion. And that means like the more meat someone eats, do they get more of the problems? And when you look at the Adventist population, there is
one thing that irks me, by the way, and he's not doing this, but perhaps Sean Baker will do this in his reply. One thing that irks me, when you say the word correlation, what do people say automatically? Like, what's the first thing that people reply when you say that X correlates with Y? Everyone kind of knows that at this point it's a bit of a meme. I think it's misunderstood. People say correlation is not causation, right? And that's true with an important caveat. Some people appear to think that correlation means that not causation. Correlation means it is not causal, which is of course dumb, right? It's just saying that it's not sufficient to prove that something is causal. It could be the case that it's causal, and of course if something, yeah, Brett is on it, yeah. Of course, if something is causal, then it will be correlated, right? If vegan diets do cause better health outcomes, then of course they will be correlated, right? So what we really should say is correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Correlation does not imply causation in all cases. But if things are correlated, that is an indication that it could be causal. And of course, if things are causally connected, then they will also be correlated. So yeah, I feel like a lot of people hear the correlation word and immediately correlation doesn't mean causation. And some people take that to mean that it means that they're not causally connected, which is of course a misunderstanding. Hey, Indef, how's it going? Nice to see you.
Is a mortality benefit of over 13% from the meat eater to the vegan population. And you could pick any disease, heart disease, you could pick diabetes, any of these, and there's a stepwise dose-dependent benefit towards less meat. So we could go over some of the other populations that are out there that have been studied, but I really like the Adventist meat studies. The other studies that are out there aren't really looking at vegan or vegetarian, but are taking large populations, for instance, Harvard's Nurses Health and Health Population Studies, where what they're starting to do now is not necessarily say meat, but they're looking at healthy plant-based diet index versus non-healthy plant-based diet index. And they're looking at those, and people with the healthiest plant-based diet index and the most plant protein tend to live longer. In fact, there was a study just came out yesterday that showed shifting from animal protein to plant protein was associated with better long-term aging.
Yesterday?
Jeez, it just came out. I don't know the actual name of it, but it's in the news all over the place right now. It was published out of Harvard. Dr. Hu was who's the chairman of Harvard's nutrition. And
name really Doctor Who.
And they were looking at healthy aging. They have a healthy aging index, and then looking at plant protein versus animal protein versus total protein. And I will say this, in my book, I am pretty anti-protein. We could get into why. I have changed quite a bit over the time that I'm a little bit more positive towards more protein, not excess protein, but more protein provided that it's plant-based, based on some of these studies that have come out.
Does this look like it?
It looks like it might be it, yeah.
Sean, I wanted to have you go next, but real quick, we talked about this before. Right before this, I think we all had lunch. What did you have for lunch, Garth?
I had 2 pieces of Ezekiel bread, which is sprouted grain, with some mustard, some hummus, and some arugula with sprouts, broccoli sprouts.
I had bacon and eggs. What did you have, Sean?
Well, I haven't had lunch yet. I'm 2 hours. I'm in the Pacific time zone. You guys are both Central, I believe, and so I'm still waiting. So I've got two New York strips waiting for me. So
Lunch mugged.
I'll have that after this. So I'm looking forward to it. So I think that one thing we have to remember, you mentioned a whole bunch of different saturated fat driving, LDL cholesterol. And we do see a small trend towards that in the general population. There was
Yes, I had bacon. I had processed meat. Brilliant.
just a huge meta-analysis that was done a couple days ago. David Ludwig, Adrian Sotomoto was a primary, and they found that. And again, I'm interested in a specific population. These are people that are on low carb diets, that aren't eating processed foods, that are eating a lot of meat. And in that particular type of population, we see that the biggest.
Okay, here's the low carb obfuscation. So that's one thing that we were reading in the evidence yesterday, that there is some evidence for some health benefits for low carb diets, and it's short term and so on, and often uncontrolled. Oh no, I don't want to speak out of turn. I can't remember, but there was some evidence for some benefits for some short term benefits from low carb diets, but that's not necessarily animal based diets. Right, so already we're conflating the two here. No, not going in with evidence for an animal-based diet, I notice. We're starting on the low-carb diet, so bit of a Mott and Bailey already from Sean.
This driver for LDL increases are, in fact, being lean. And Garth is a weight loss surgeon. He knows the value of being lean. That generally reduces your risk for diabetes, heart disease, cancer, pretty much every chronic disease gets better when we get leaner. And so in that particular population, we see for some reason LDL goes up, and being lean seems to predict that. So that's unusual, to say the least. It wouldn't be what you expect. In fact, in that low carb population, they found that being obese actually caused that the LDL cholesterol go down. So then you start to say, well, is it better for me to be obese than lean? And I don't think it is. When we talk about saturated fat, remember saturated fat it's not just one thing. Saturated fat, is it myristic acid, lauric acid, caproic acid, caprylic acid? Is it stearic, oleic, on and on and on. So we can talk about what are these different saturated fats and how do they independently affect us. And we also have to realize that in the United States, where does saturated fat come from? If we look at a Western diet, and interestingly, the majority of some of the biggest drivers of saturated.
One thing that I've noticed a lot of the meatheads do as well is just the argument becomes like, well, it's much more complicated. So saying, well, look, there's a load of different types of saturated fat. So, you can't just talk about saturated fat broadly. There's a lot of different types of saturated fat. I wonder if we're going to see any arguments that certain types of saturated fat are not bad, or that certain types of saturated fat are beneficial, or if it's just going to be an appeal to it's complicated, so as to muddy the picture there. Is there going to be any case for some of the types of saturated fat that he's just mentioned are not harmful and some of them are? And so differentiating in that way is useful? Or is it just going to be a case of saying, well, there's lots of different types of this? Because if so, I mean, that's a pretty dumb trick, right? You could say about anything bad. It could be true that burning fossil fuels exacerbates climate change, for example. And a fossil fuel defender could say, well, there's a bunch of different types of fossil fuels, and there's natural gas, and there's coal, and there's oil, and there's different types of oil. They're not saying some of these are not bad for the environment, or some of these are beneficial for the environment, right? They're just kind of appealing to, well, it's complicated. So we'll see if we do get any kind of argument that some of these are not bad. But yeah, this is something that I've noticed in a lot of the meatheads doing, just appealing to it's complicated and there's more to it, and then no further argument that actually some of these variations that I'm pointing to are not bad or are beneficial. We'll see.
Saturated fat consumption are sandwiches, dessert products, cakes, things like that. Cakes have, eggs and butter and sometimes dairy products. And really only 4% of our saturated fat consumption comes from whole unprocessed meat.
Wait, what? But he's just talking about more animal products. Yeah, well, actually a lot of the saturated fat we consume might come from cakes. And cakes are bad because they contain milk and butter and eggs. It's literally just naming more animal products. If they're ingredients in a cake, they somehow count differently. All right.
Steak or something like that, or a piece of chicken or fish. And so we have all these sort of dietary confounders that plague all of these epidemiologic studies. The recent study from Harvard that showed that red meat increased risk for diabetes by 62%. Lasagna was defined as red meat. Sandwiches are just defined as red meat.
Yeah. Lasagna normally has beef in it, right? Classic lasagna recipe. This one also has prosciutto. 750 grams lean beef. Okay, so yes.
So I would contend that we're not answering the question that, at least not to the interest of the population that I am promoting. And so I'm saying what happens when you don't eat processed food and you're just eating a whole food meat-based diet. If I were to say that to Garth that, hey, a vegan diet is Oreo cookies, Coca-Cola, vegan cheese, and a couple pieces of fruit and vegetables, he of course would push back on that. And I think this is the same sort of scenario here. And we don't really have a lot of studies on people eating.
They do be doing that in the ultra-processed food studies. Ultra-processed plant foods. This Rauber study, this got a lot of coverage. This study here got a lot of coverage in supposedly saying that ultra-processed plant-based meats are unhealthy. Right, this is how it was reported. Rauber ultra-processed plant foods, Imperial press release. Let's have a look at this. Plant-based UPFs linked with higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Main picture here, we've got all the plant-based meats. Heavily processed plant foods may be worse for heart health. And the authors are quoted in here as saying, where have we got the thing about meat alternatives? The researchers highlight modern plant-based diets may incorporate a range of ultra-processed foods, such as sugar-sweetened beverages, snacks, confectionery, but also the plant sauce, sausages, nuggets, and burgers that are produced with ingredients originating from plants and marketed as meat and dairy substitutes. Right, so main picture here. And of course, it was all covered in the press as plant-based meat is unhealthy, causes heart problems, and so on. And when you look into the details of what was included in this study, this is the percentage of calories coming from different foods, right? Here's the ultra-processed plant foods, 39%, sorry. 9.9% industrial packaged bread, 6.9% pastries, buns and cakes, 3.9% biscuits. Meat alternatives, 0.2% of the calories. And then they've taken this study and said processed meat alternatives are bad because they're ultra-processed. So that is mental.
Eating in the fashion I'm describing, mostly meat-based with very little to no processed, ultra-processed garbage, which I think is really the problem that we're talking about. There's very few studies that have that would meet the criteria of long-term, hard clinical endpoints, not just, we've got some biomarker that we suspect may be associated with this stuff. And so, again, I would say, I don't know.
Okay, so again, we've got the differentiation between long-term heart health outcomes, that's CVD, actually getting cardiovascular disease, actually getting cancer, actually dying, right, as opposed to short-term biomarkers like increased cholesterol, for example, or weight gain. Now, this is the specific thing that did not exist in terms of evidence supporting an animal-based diet when we were asking about it yesterday. So, interesting that he's going down this road here. We lack long-term health outcome data. Surely Garth is going to say, is there any long-term health outcome data supporting that an animal-based diet is superior?
I will say, I don't know if my diet is going to make somebody live longer. I don't know if it's going to.
What? But that's what you're meant to be arguing, isn't it? So, all right, we're 20 minutes in, and Sean Baker's saying, I don't know if this diet's going to make people live longer. Surely that's the main thing that you're meant to be defending.
Either prevent or increase the likelihood of some disease, because we just don't have the data that shows that now.
What? Surely you think you do have some data that shows this. Aren't you meant to be arguing that an animal-based diet or a carnivore diet is better for your health? This is his first time that he's spoken in the debate. He's not been pressed at all. And already we're conceding that we don't have any data that shows that a carnivore diet's associated with better health outcomes. Okay.
What I can say is in the short term, which I do think is valuable, by the way. I think when you have a patient that's in front of you that's sick and suffering, if you have an option to make them no longer sick and suffering, that's kind of what you're supposed to be doing as a physician. Now, the long-term stuff, I think, is at best speculative, even though we have literally...
What? Okay, there's so much wrong with this. The long-term stuff is at best speculative. Literally, that is how I would describe the evidence in favor of an animal-based diet. Based on what we've read yesterday, the evidence is at best speculative. The meat-promoting person in the middle looks like, not sure. You're not doing that well here, Sean. Garth looks a bit confused, as am I. Like, isn't this what you're meant to be arguing for? Not only that, but he's just said that never mind short-term markers, that's not really about hard health outcomes. And now he's saying, well, we don't have any long-term data, but that's not really a problem because the long-term data stuff is at best speculative. So do you want the long-term data or do you want the short-term data? Because if you're going to say, well, it can alleviate short-term problems and that's a good thing, well, then Garth's allowed to bring up the evidence that switching to plant-based meat from meat to plant-based meat results in weight loss, right? And lower cholesterol. Surely.
We spent billions of dollars on epidemiologic studies, Adventist Health, all the stuff coming out of Harvard, Epic Oxford, all those studies which are, Nurses Health, on and on. We've spent lots of money on those studies. I don't think they've really shown us that much definitively. I mean, it's speculative at best. And again, it doesn't describe the population that I am concerned with.
I think what Sean is, and actually, Sean, I applaud you. That was a very, I agree with your position in that we don't know. I think Sean's relating to when he brings up Soto and Ludwig study. Ludwig has come up with this concept.
We can already tell this is going to be nowhere near as spicy as the militant vegan debate, right? I've not seen anything from the Garth Davis guy, but he seems like he's going to be quite committed to being quite polite, basically. Which it's a choice. I mean, this guy's an MD and is, has his own reputation, doesn't want to be screaming at him like the militant vegan and so on. But you got to point out that you've just conceded in your opening bit that there's no good evidence supporting an animal-based diet. Hopefully he does do that.
Of certain people are hyper responders to the increase in saturated fat in a low-carb diet, but it doesn't matter because they decrease their triglycerides and they decrease their HDL. And does that protect them long-term? And the study that he brought up, that became a big topic with letters to the editor that came back and forth. And there was a pretty interesting discussion. I mean, first of all, in that study with the hyper responder, that the most overweight people, so the idea was the overweight person goes on a low carb diet, they don't get as much of a rise in LDL cholesterol as someone like Sean. So Sean might go on a carnivore diet and his LDL goes up. Now, does it matter? Look at Sean. Does it matter if Sean's LDL cholesterol goes up? Does that make him unhealthy? He feels good. He's setting world records. Does that make him unhealthy? And that is a probably pretty essential question for us to answer. Now, in that study, there were obviously, as most studies, I mean, we could point out study flaws all the time. I think that probably bores people, but there are some important parts. The overweight.
I think I'm right in saying, I could be wrong about this, but I think I'm right in saying there aren't, like if you're not having blood tests or checking your cholesterol and blood pressure and things like this, you can have a heart attack pretty much out of the blue, seemingly. So you don't necessarily feel unhealthy prior to having a heart attack. So yeah, it could well be the case that you are unhealthy and have very high levels of cholesterol and are at great risk of heart disease without necessarily subjectively feeling that way.
Weight people in that study, usually overweight people have high cholesterol. That's what I see in my daily practice all the time. Usually they're on statins to protect them. They did no, and I mean no, control for statins in that study with Dr. Ludwig, which was a huge problem. A large part of that study, most of the participants that was in that meta-analysis came from the Diet Fit trial. The Diet Fit trial was done by Gardner out of Stanford, and he specifically limited saturated fat intake. So while these people were on a low-carb diet, they were not on a high saturated fat diet necessarily. In fact, some of the studies in that meta-analysis did not even state the amount of saturated fat. So whether there's a saturated fat cholesterol, whether that proved that there's a hyper-responder effect is questionable. But that's out of, I think, what most of your listeners are concerned about. I think the central question and the really interesting question is someone who has high LDL but is otherwise healthy, are they at risk because their LDL is elevated? That is a very important question.
Because, well, I mean, I think a couple things on that particular Sotomayor study. I mean, they did have individualized, the IPD, the individualized personal data on about.
It seemed like he didn't want him to get to the question of whether someone's unhealthy if they have high LDL cholesterol. He's kind of cut him off and is going to talk about something else now. So that's something to note. We'll see if I'm sure Geralt's going to come back to this point.
A third of the population, and they did actually. There was a chart in there where it talks about statin or no statin in there. So there's one of the figures there. There's like a cluster of 4, BMI versus LDL curves, and one of them talks about, I believe, statin, if I'm not mistaken. I think I saw that. So, but I do agree with your point.
Okay, interesting. So, well, yeah, that was an interesting point that Garth says. Got a look on his face like he's going to disagree with this. But that did seem like an odd association that Sean Baker said in his opening bit, that in this particular study that more obese people had lower cholesterol. That's certainly not the way around you would expect that to be. And Garth saying, well, obese people are often on statins to lower their cholesterol, and they didn't control for that in this study, so that's probably why. Sean saying maybe they did control for statins. Garth looks like he's going to disagree.
Garth, is there this hyper responder study that is protective? And I will be the first one to say I don't think we know yet. I think we need more data before we can make those claims. And just so you know, when I talk to my patients and the people that I talk to, I never tell them to ignore LDL cholesterol. I say at the very least get some imaging and follow some imaging over time to see if there is a risk for you, because I think the sort of speculation, I'll just call it speculation at this point, is that if you have low triglycerides and you're not diabetic and you have low blood pressure, you don't have any evidence of hypertension, and you're lean, maybe that LDL is not as a relevant risk factor. Mortensen study, the Western Denmark study, where they showed that if you have 0 CAC score, then the likelihood to progression to one of these so-called MACE, major adverse cardiac events, was independent and not related to LDL cholesterol. So we are starting to see that maybe there's some populations where they do have the tendency to develop heart disease, and cholesterol becomes very problematic for them. Maybe there's this sort of outlier population, which the size of which is unknown at this point, and it may be driven by people going low carb and getting good exercise and losing weight, and that may be protective. We don't know the answer to that yet. I don't think we do.
Yeah, I mean, we don't, but we've got things that could tell us the risk. Now, I think if you're telling someone there's a risk, right, you got a patient, you say, look, these are the risks, and you're having a risk-benefit analysis, then you're doing the right thing. There's problems. So that Westermark study was kind of interesting. I was fascinated by that study.
What's it called?
I don't know if you know this study,
Mortensen
Lauren,
from 2022,
but,
I believe.
Mortensen 2022 study.
Yeah, I think I sent it to you.
Yeah. Yeah, it was Western Denmark Heart Registry. It's a pretty cool study that's been discussed quite a bit, because what happened is they looked at people with LDL cholesterol, but they looked at them in light of their coronary calcium score. And so what they found was, if you've got coronary calcium, your LDL, hands down, has an effect on whether or not you have a coronary event. And so obviously, if you go and get a coronary score and you've got calcium, you should not be getting an elevated LDL. But what they found out is that this association between LDL and heart disease totally went away if your coronary score was 0. And so that's what Sean's saying. It's like, what if you've got someone that comes in and their coronary score is 0 and they're going on your carnivore diet and their LDL cholesterol is going up, but they're lean and their triglycerides are okay? Are they safe? Now, there's some important factors. If you look at the Western Denmark study that you got up right there, there are some different age differences. I don't know why they don't discuss this. This is the problem with research, is that you really have to kind of dig into the weeds on it a bit, because when you look at the different ages in the two groups, there's a considerable age difference. So the group with the low coronary artery score was in there, I think it was 53. And then the group with the that actually had coronary artery plaque was 62. So we've got about a 10-year difference. Well, plaque forms over a 10 years. So you could say that those 53-year-olds may have formed plaque when they got to 62. Follow-up is only 5 years. So, 5 years is really not enough to tell us with heart disease whether or not they're going to have a cardiac event. And then the last thing I'll tell you is that when you look at studies like the MESA study, about 30% of people, or maybe even more than that, maybe I think it was a third to a quarter of people in the MESA study, which is a large American population study, where they looked at people with cardiac events who had a coronary score of 0. They attributed to about one-third to one-fourth of the populations that had a heart attack. In other words, just because you have 0 coronary calcium doesn't mean you don't have plaque. So you could have an atheroma, like a plaque in the beginning of a plaque inside your vessel, and it hasn't ruptured yet. So I don't think we could necessarily look at that Danish study. I think the best thing would be if we had a group of people, a large group of people, and we followed them that had, varying LDL cholesterols, and we followed them for many years and made sure that they didn't have any other diseases. And this is exactly what they did in the Cooper Clinic in Dallas. So in the Cooper Clinic in Dallas, they enrolled, I think, 30,000 people. They followed them now 24 years. They had varying degrees of LDL cholesterol, but they did not have elevated triglycerides. They were lean. They did not smoke. They did not drink. They exercised. So it's the kind of people we're talking about. If you look at the results on this, if you look at the graphing on it, I don't know if you want to look up the Cooper study there. Amit Kara it's the Cooper longitudinal study. The interesting thing is, in the first 10 years of follow-up, you don't see anything. So in the first 10 years of follow-up, the different LDL cholesterols really had no consequence at all on cardiac events. But when you start following it out 20 to 30 years, you start seeing a humongous difference in the different groups. They based them on LDL of 160 to 189, and the lowest group was less than 100. And the difference in mortality at 30 years was highly, highly significant. I think it's a 60% reduction in mortality if you kept your cholesterol below 100. So those are the kind of things that concern me. We could come up with this idea that there could be a hyper responder that doesn't get sick because their LDL cholesterol is high. But the problem we got to note is that this is something we need to follow over a long period of time. Not
yeah, I don't disagree with
study.
long-term follow-up to say it. I do think these studies need to be done because whether you say it's bad or something, there's people that are doing it regardless. And I think we need to know what the results are because.
Okay, that's super interesting. So he's just making the point that, again, a lot of the evidence which the pro-carnivore, pro-animal-based diets people are going to cite are short-term follow-up, right? And the one that Sean brought up, Garth saying, well, they only followed them for 5 years. And in this other study with a longer follow-up, you don't see any difference for cardiac arrest based on LDL cholesterol in the first 10 years, but if you look 20, 30 years out, then you do. Up to a 60% reduction in cardiac events for people with low cholesterol. So that's huge. You can cut in half your risk of cardiac event by keeping cholesterol low. I think it's a pretty central belief for a lot of these carnivore types that cholesterol is basically irrelevant. But for the most part, they're just looking at short-term studies where, it could easily be the case that something is affecting your health, but over 5 or even 10 years, it's not going to be a significant impact. And it's not until you look years out into the future that you start to see big decreases or big increases in the risk of cardiac events.
I mean, quite honestly, Garth, I talk to a lot of people that do ketogenic, low-carb, carnivore diets because they get a health benefit. Maybe they've had Crohn's disease and it went away. And I ask them, hey, what if your risk for heart disease has increased by 50%? And you know what 99% of them people tell me? They say, I don't care because I feel better now and I don't want to go back to living like I did.
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, obviously a bit more than 100% increase on the evidence that Garth's showing. The carnivore advocate in this case is basically saying live fast, die young, right? That's essentially the position. Live fast, die young, live too bloody fast sometimes. But dying young, and he's just saying, well, people don't really care that much about dying young. Okay.
And I say, you know what, is it reasonable for you to take a lipid-lowering drug? I literally tell them that may be an option for you because we don't know the answer yet. At the very least, get imaging to follow up so you can continue to follow this every 3 to 5 years. I think that, and again, I'm not, I don't have the MESA study in front of me or the Cooper study you showed me in front of me. But my question would be, during that 20-year follow-up, did those people remain lean? Did they remain metabolically healthy? And I don't know if that data is available. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Maybe it was just on baseline data, and we don't know what happened with. Right. So we don't know what they did over time with regard to those other risk factors. Yeah. So that would be a question I would have. Now, the other thing is, Matt Budoff, who's done this Feldman study, this lean mass hyperpreponderance study where they showed the preliminary data. People 55-year-old average age are on a ketogenic diet for 5 years on average. Their LDL cholesterol is, ridiculously sky high. Compared to the Miami Heart, they have the same number of plaque score, basically a total plaque score based on CCTA. And, people are saying they're going to run it for a year. They've actually got funding to run it out 3 to 5 years, I think. So they'll have a little bit longer data. Matt Budoff is, what's his name? Thomas Dayspring, one of the leading lipidologists in the world, basically acknowledges Matt. He acknowledges Matt Budoff as an expert in plaque progression based on CCTA. And that's what a lot of these pharmaceutical companies will use. They'll use a 6-month trial, a year trial to look at plaque progression when they're developing the latest, PCSK9 inhibitor or something like that. So they say it's good enough for a drug trial to get it cleared by the FDA, and they're using shorter windows with that level of precision with CCTA because it's more detailed than, say, a CAC score or some of these other studies. Now, some people say, well, you're missing subendothelial plaque because you're not doing an intravascular ultrasound. But realistically, there's no studies that show that people just develop massive stretches of subendothelial plaque and it doesn't go into the luminal. Usually it shows if it's going subendothelial, it equally is going intraluminally. So we're getting intraluminal data, which I think is significant. And again, these studies have not been published yet. We still have to wait before, I'm not out here telling people, I mean, I know, you see some of the social media goofy side of me. You don't see what I'm telling people day to day when I talk to people. And when I tell people, we don't know yet. And so I would be cautious. If your LDL is high, consider lowering it. If you don't want to do that maybe you don't want to go on the drugs, maybe you don't want to change your diet, then at the very least, serially image what's going on until we have more data. And I think that is a reasonable approach. I'm not I don't want to have heart disease. That's what I do for myself. I had a CAC score when I was 51. It was 0. I'm going to get another one probably this year. Hopefully it'll still be 0. If it's not, I may change things. I'm not married to this. This isn't an ideology for me. And like you, I don't tell people, you don't tell everybody to go vegan. You tell them, hey, reduce your garbage. I'm sure you're telling everybody to reduce the garbage and the sugar and all the added oils and things like that.
Okay, this is interesting. Here you've got the person who coined the term carnivore diet, seems to be very proud of that accolade. And he's saying, actually, we don't really know the long-term health effects of this. And I might get my bloods done, and if it's bad, I might sack it off. Which is fair play to him for saying that. No, saying that in a conversation with doctor who advocates for plant-based diets here, so he's probably a bit more measured in what he's saying, right, than if he was just speaking on his own. But if you're somebody who watches this guy or watches carnivore diet influencers and thinks that this is the way to go, like, this should be cause for reflection. Right, the main guy advocating for the carnivore diet is actually saying, well, we don't really know the long-term health effects of this. And to be honest, I'll probably get some bloods done, and if it comes out bad, I'll probably sack off carnivore. So people who are very confident about, health benefits and human flourishing benefits from carnivore and animal-based diet, this should be some cause to moderate that belief, I would think.
Like that. Eat a healthy plant-based diet. If you want to include some lean chicken breasts in there, go for it. Likewise, I tell people, try carnivore. You may want to add some fruit, some vegetables, things like that if it works for you. And I think that's, again, we just disagree on how much meat's in there, right? I think that's the main disagreement here.
Yeah, and I think for the listeners, Budoff's study is really interesting because we're talking about CAC score. So
CAC. I mean, CAC is what we do.
CAC. It's such a funny sound. So that's a calcium. Yeah. So CT imaging, you're looking for calcium plaques. So now this is a pretty mature type lesion, right? You've got a calcium plaque. It's been calcified. So it's at least.
Realize Budoff's study is not CAC. It's CCTA. It's angiography, right? Okay. Got it. Okay.
Right. That's what I was going to play. Right. So I just was trying to explain to people that Budoff's is much more advanced because now what they're actually looking at is if there's an atheroma that isn't calcified yet. So their calcium score could be 0, but you could have the beginning of a plaque starting to go into the vessel, but it's not yet calcified. So you could pick up something a lot earlier. I think Budoff's study will be really interesting. Nadolsky kind of came up with the idea of the study, and Budoff is somewhat wrong with it. Nadolsky's been a little bit upset because they're looking at some very short-term work. Like you mentioned, we need longer-term with that. But I do think it's...
I know quite a bit. I literally know all the authors of that study. And Spencer didn't come up with the study. He was asked to participate as a collaboration of dissent, right? And his concern was that they were excluding people with significant cardiovascular disease as based on a CCT, on a CAC score. And they actually excluded only one patient for that. The actual number was one patient was excluded. And they were actually excluded for another reason. It just so happens that they had a high CAC score, but they do have patients that do have some plaque in there. So they're a lot of them have 0, but there is, I think 45% have a total plaque score between 8 and 0. 45 is maxed out. You know, they look at 15 segments and they grade it from 0 to 3, 0 none, 3 severe. So the max score you could get is 3 times 15, which would be 45. So their top guys have about 8, which is pretty consistent with the Miami Heart Study, which is another healthy population, which they they cross-match the best they could. And so we will see if those people that have plaque either regress, progress, or stay the same. And I think we might even see some regression in there, which would be, because I've seen that anecdotally. Now, again, I can't claim anything because it's all anecdotal. But if we start seeing regression of plaque in these people with LDL cholesterol of 400, that's going to be, in my view, sort of eye-opening. I would imagine you would agree with that.
That would be
So
eye-opening.
I wanted to chime in on this really quick too, because this is something that just to me is sort of one of the bigger questions in my mind. Kind of like what you were saying, Sean, with like the personal experiences that everybody has of just feeling better. The reason I eat mostly meat now, I never used to ever. Like I actually used to have an eating disorder when I was younger. So I didn't eat much of a lot of things, honestly. But when I started to eat more meat, I felt full. I've looked better. I had more energy. I was, I don't know how to explain it. I was all around better in every way. And so that's what got me going into getting more interested in this lifestyle. And then I started learning about it and understanding it. And then I started seeing that other people were feeling better. And anyways, I cured an eating disorder with this lifestyle. And I tried everything prior to that. Now, granted, I was having a lot of processed foods too.
I'm just wondering if you could call eating only meat or eating only animal products its own type of eating disorder. I mean, I don't mean to diminish this person's experience. I mean, this is something people say about vegan diets, right? That a lot of times people who follow a vegan diet have had some sort of other eating disorder. That doesn't, of course, mean anything bad about either the vegan diet or the carnivore diet in this case, but it's just interesting to note that, yeah, I mean, it seems like people who have a tendency to be very obsessed about what they're eating will be in these kind of categories. And the main thing I want to know here actually is it's all very vibes based again. Let's hear her description of the health benefits of having an all meat diet and see how vibes based this is.
When I started to eat more meat, I felt full. I've looked better. I had more energy. I was, I don't know how to explain it. I was all around better in every way. And so
any particular health markers to talk about? Anything quantifiable or tangible? Or is it just kind of vibes-based, subjective?
So that's what got me going into getting more interested in this lifestyle. And then I started learning about it and understanding it. And then I started seeing that other people were feeling better. And anyways, I cured an eating disorder with this lifestyle. And
seeing that other people are feeling better, again, is like anecdotal, right? This is not proper evidence. And this is what we were coming across yesterday in our perplexity search, that it is a lot of it extrapolated from anecdotal evidence.
Tried everything prior to that. Now, granted, I was having a lot of processed foods too. So I hadn't removed those before going to this carnivore lifestyle. But my question is, why isn't there more interest from the plant-based community in this carnivore lifestyle or an animal-based lifestyle? If it's working for people and if it's helping them, why isn't there more curiosity as to why? Because like we have science, we have studies, we have all these things, but
oh no. Well, the reason that there isn't more interest in it is because there's no proper scientific evidence to support the benefits of it. And look, you can have interest and curiosity and say, well, we should look into whether there's proper scientific evidence to support benefits of an animal-based diet. Okay, we've looked into it, and it doesn't seem like there is. If anything, it seems like the reverse. So that's probably why there isn't like sustained interest. And again, you can do, carry on doing studies on this kind of stuff, right? We'll wait for any long-term health outcomes data or any strong kind of evidence for health benefits from an animal-based diet. It doesn't exist at the moment. And in fact, all of the long-term health outcome data suggests that it's detrimental and that plant-based diets are healthier. So at the moment, her question is basically, why are these vibes and anecdotes not compelling to people who are following the scientific evidence that supports a plant-based diet being healthier?
But it's not, a lot of things aren't working. Like our heart disease is like skyrocketed, right? So to me, it's confusing because it's like, why do we get so stuck on ideologies, and why aren't we looking, why isn't this kind of a conversation happening more often? Do you know what I mean? So does it at all are you curious about why this might be working for so many people? And also, sorry, by the way, can you just don't click the little, pen if you would. Yeah, I was just picking up on the thing. I was in it too.
Yeah. Okay, so a few things. Why isn't it curious? I mean, a lot of people are plant-based, not for their health, right? So those people are not going to be curious no matter what you show. This is an ethical decision for them, and that's not an interest. The other thing is, you can't throw away data. I mean, we've got a lot of studies. I mean, I've got a whole table here, if you want me to start going through studies that associate meat with heart disease, especially, of all things. Now, unprocessed meat does a lot better than processed meat. So we could get, Sean brought this up earlier, and it's going to be true on a plant-based diet too. There's a healthy meat, healthier meat. And
she's like, well, I had bacon for lunch though, because that felt like the vibe. So what do you say to that, Doc?
There's a healthier plant-based diet, but there is a clear, in multiple studies showing long-term consumption of meat is associated with our number one killer, heart disease. And this is in multiple different cohorts in multiple different parts of the world. Whether you're looking at Epic, whether you're looking at Venice, whether you're looking at Shanghai, whether you're looking, I mean, there's so many different studies. I've got books and things on it. So there's definitely a correlation. I don't think you could throw that away. And I think feeling better is not necessarily the answer. So you could feel better and yet still be sick. I mean, there have been some, and we've seen it on both plant and animal side, but we've seen some very famous people.
Yeah, he's saying what I said more politely. Yes, there is actually proper evidence for health benefits for plant-based diet, and there is not proper evidence for health benefits from an animal-based diet. So, pretty good answer. That's why there isn't more interest in animal-based diets. You're saying you feel better, but that's not. That doesn't compete with large cohorts of epidemiological studies.
Charles Poliquin, people like this that are like big, muscular, six-pack abs, drop dead of heart disease. All right, and so I don't know that you could necessarily.
Right, that's what I was saying. That you could be ostensibly healthy and at high risk of a heart attack. Yeah, I thought that's the case.
Necessarily say I feel better means I am better. You could feel better just because you're not eating as much junk food. You take anybody on a standard American diet, I don't care what you do. You put them on a meat-based diet, you could put them on a vegan diet, they're going to feel...
Sure.
Well, I mean, I think it's dangerous to use Charles Poliquin or what was the guy, Bob, the Biggest Loser guy. I mean, because, for every one of those headline-grabbing, anomalous, lean guys that has a heart attack, there's 5,000 couch potatoes with a big belly. I mean, the cath labs are not lined up with lean guys with abs getting stents. I mean...
So now we don't like the anecdotal evidence, Sean. Are we doing anecdotes or no? And of course, he's saying this to imply that this is not a proper correlation here. And Garth's going to say, but there is a proper correlation here. For every one of these guys, 5,000 offset. Right now, that's not... The data shows that increased consumption of meat, particularly red and processed meat, increases your risk of heart disease.
Yeah.
We know it's all what we're seeing there. So So, I mean,
Sure.
it's just like I could say somebody smoked and
anecdotal.
lived to 100. I mean, great.
Yeah.
There's people that do that. So to me, that's not, I mean, I think generally people that are generally healthy are generally healthy, and they feel good. They look good. They perform well. They don't have aches and pains. They're not depressed. I think that is a general sign of health. And to say that, well, there's this one guy that was lean that had a heart attack is, you know, I mean, I think that's not really particularly helpful in my view. But I think that, yeah.
I don't disagree, but I think that there are
Sure, of course.
subclinical markers that we need to look at that may tell us something about the future. It's interesting to me with LDL cholesterol and inflammation. Inflammation is kind of interesting to me because inflammation's all over the place, right? But we do know that there is this idea of inflammatory aging or inflammaging, as they're talking about it now. And this is the kind of thing that's going to affect you later in life, but you might not feel it at this very moment. I was looking at a study of Ludwig's, which was another one. So Ludwig is a smart guy, right? He is probably the head keto expert at this point. And he does this study. This was in 2016, done with Eveling. And they were looking at increases in protein and changes in resting metabolic rate. And they happened to measure C-reactive protein, and it went up in the low protein group. So did urinary cortisol. All right, so these people are definitely under inflammation. They're in their low protein group. And interestingly, in every study he's done since then, they don't measure C-reactive protein or urinary cortisol. Was that just a aberrant finding? That aside, because there's other studies showing increases in C-reactive protein. But my question would then be, were those people feeling bad? And the answer is no, those people weren't feeling bad. They were feeling fine. They didn't know that they had an elevated urinary cortisol. They didn't know that their C-reactive protein was higher. They thought they were doing fantastic, and they had an increase in their resting metabolic rate. So it's these kind of subclinical things that
as you mentioned, C-reactive protein is a non-specific acute phase reactant, and it, you know, a lot of things can drive it up. I mean, in my experience, when I see people on a carnivore diet, initially their C-reactive protein will go up in many cases, but by 2-3 months, it's no longer elevated. And so I think it's just stressful to change diets. I mean, it doesn't matter what diet you go on in many cases. It is a stress on the system. A lot of people are. I mean, we know there is a phase where, you go from high carbohydrate to primarily fat base. There's enzymatic upregulation that has to occur. There's cell types that populate the gut that change. Those things take weeks to do. And so some of these studies where we're looking at, particularly these short-term studies, which I am also not a fan of, you do like the Netflix twin study. I mean, it was 8 weeks. I mean, that's not long enough to make any real, sort of clinical outcome measures. I mean, we're measuring a couple biomarkers, which may or may not mean what we think they mean. So I agree with you about the need for long-term studies. Again, they're expensive. They are hard to get anybody to volunteer.
Is really going back and forth on whether long-term is important. Earlier he was saying long-term's not really important and it's speculative at best, and if people feel better in the short term, that's what's most important. And many of my patients say that they don't care if they have an increased risk of heart disease because they feel better now. And now he's saying, well, these studies with the biomarkers are too short. We don't really know the long-term impacts. 8 weeks not long enough. So he's really just able to jump back and forth between those two, whatever seems to suit his argument. I think you have to say, do you want to talk about long-term outcomes or not? Because it's no good saying, well, that's too long-term and who cares about long-term, when we talk about increased risk of cardiovascular disease and increased risk of early mortality and increased risk of cancer. And then when we talk about short-term measures, say improved LDL cholesterol, improved weight loss, and so on, saying, well, that's only short-term and we really need to look at long-term outcomes. Like, do we want to talk about long-term outcomes or not? Because he's just jumping back and forth between the two at the moment.
The best study in the world we could do is lock twins up in a metabolic ward for 50 years. That's never going to happen. I mean, that's something that we can't do. Right. So we're kind of stuck with these sort of inferior studies. I think the whole field of nutrition is limited. It's not a pure science. We can't we can't just, like an animal, like at least with an animal study, you can cut them open and kill them and cut them open and look what's going on. We can't ethically do that with human beings. We can't leave them locked in cages for their whole lifespan. So we have some real problems with that. This is what is that, a correlation?
I wonder if he could name a trait. I wonder if he could name a trait between the two.
Relation between red meat consumption and diabetes rates.
Yeah, so I'm quoting Nina Teicholz.
Yeah, I mean
there's a bunch of studies like that.
Yeah, that study.
Well,
to me, I look at that and it's correlation doesn't equal causation. We'll see that argument. To me, it's hard to make the argument that red meat is driving diabetes.
There it is. There it is.
Diabetes, when you see stuff like that, I mean, it's, to me, I'm like, well, why don't they at least somewhat go in the right direction? I mean, it's kind of negative correlation. Again, that's not perfect, but probably negative correlation is probably more powerful than positive correlation. It's not perfect.
So the way I look at this imperfect world is to try to do several things.
That's an interesting claim. What's the basis of that, I wonder? Negative correlation is more powerful than positive correlation. I've never heard someone say that before.
If I'm going to look at studies, typically I want to look at a meta-analysis. More specifically, not even a meta-analysis, it's a systematic review. Because with a systematic review, I could look at a forest plot and I could see if there's heterogeneity. So if I'm looking at a variable and I'm looking at a forest plot and there's one outlier, but most of the outliers are saying most of them are saying one issue. Okay, I could say that there's probably some belief in that. Whereas if it's all over the place and the heterogeneity is huge, I'm saying, okay, maybe there isn't a correlation. But what I usually I'll look at an issue. We could take diabetes. So why would red meat cause diabetes? And there's really strong correlative data here. But we could say correlation isn't causation. But there's pretty strong correlation. So we got to start looking at, well, the next thing we got to do is look at mechanistic studies. What's the mechanism? And so the mechanism is that we are basically designed to eat carbs, right? We've got amylase in our saliva. Every cell in our body has insulin receptors and carb receptors, and the carb gets introduced into the cell and is processed for energy. Every cell in our body does that. What happens when you overfeed someone carbs? Do they become fat? No. De novo lipogenesis is very low. Our body's able to process those carbs or store them as glycogen. Again, these are all mechanistic studies. What happens if you introduce saturated fat into the equation? In other words, I could do a trial. I could make someone insulin resistant in minutes by hooking them up to an IV and injecting saturated fat. In fact, that's what we're about to use in a study I'm doing to create an insulin resistant model. Or more specifically, Kevin Hall did a ward study where he used the patients as their own control and did crossover, and he fed them either a low carb, high fat diet or a plant-based high carb diet. On the high carb diet, they became more insulin sensitive. On the low carb diet, they actually failed their oral glucose tolerance test. And why is that? Because saturated fat interferes with the production of the GLUT4 receptor, which is the insulin receptor that allows sugar to get into the cell. This is all mechanistic. So you could say, this is mechanistic, this is nonsense. But then what if we look at a long-term population study? And long-term population studies show that populations that start eating more saturated fat tend to get more diabetes. And then when we start looking at multivariate regression analysis and even meta-regression studies, we see an even stronger correlation. And so we've got a mechanism and we've got these large population studies. And that's when I start to put more weight into a situation. It's not just one study. It's this conglomeration.
Yeah, let me just comment on a couple of those things. So the one, the study you're going to do where you inject saturated fat into people's blood and they become
Yeah, we never came back to the different types of saturated fat, by the way. That was Sean's opening thing. He said, well, there's all these different types of saturated fat. We haven't yet come back and said, here's the difference between them, and here's why some of them are bad and some of them are good and some of them are okay, right? It's just seemed like that was just trying to muddy the waters. I don't know, maybe it's still going to come up, but nothing yet.
Insulin resistance. That is known. I mean, that happens. We know that when there's more circulating saturated fat in the blood, particularly palmitic acid, that leads to ceramide accumulation, which interferes with the insulin receptor and makes it less effective. However, the interesting thing is, and Jeff Volek showed this in, I think, a study I sent you, that dietary saturated fat does not necessarily mean blood saturated fat, because that palmitic acid that's circulating in the blood is often as a consequence of de novo lipogenesis coming from the liver. So the liver gets the first shot at the food, right? Whether it's carbs or fat, it goes through the portal circulation, which is, gastroenteral, a GI surgeon, I'm sure you're very familiar with that. And so the liver rearranges these molecules and spits them out into the blood. So overconsumption, I will argue that overconsumption of fat or carbohydrates or fructose can lead to, de novo lipogenesis, which then downstream. So if you just inject fat into the blood or saturated fat in the blood, that isn't how it works in the real world. I mean, I don't consume, unless I'm on TPN, I don't consume my food through my veins, right? Or, and so I mean, it's kind of missing a crucial step of what the liver's doing with what we're ingesting. And then the other study, the Kevin Hall study, the metabolic ward study, where they compared a low-fat plant-based diet and animal-based high-fat diet, and the low-fat people gain less weight and they consume a reanalysis was just done by Sotomoda and Ludwig and others, and they showed that they completely misinterpreted the data. They failed to account for a crossover effect. The biggest effect on that study was C-peptide. C-peptide had a bigger predictive effect on who gained more weight. The other thing was the diet order. And there is, as I mentioned, that 3 to 4 week period where enzymes are being upregulated and there was no washout period. He went directly from one to the other. So they bypassed the washout period, which is a pretty big faux pas. And in fact, Walter Willett actually has said that he thinks perhaps that study should be retracted on camera. So it's kind of an interesting sort of scenario.
So I want to chime in really quick here, Garth.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I don't know if it should.
I don't mean to cut you off. Just for the sake of time, why don't we wrap this one up? Leave your last point there in a minute or so, if that's okay, if that's possible, and then we'll move on to the next topic, which I think does.
We've been an hour. We've been an hour on one topic. So.
What's that?
Yeah.
One quick thing, because we're with the IV thing. I don't know if you've heard of the Raceris muffin studies, but we are probably going towards that. So they did a study on muffins. Muffins are kind of interesting because you can make them with polyunsaturated fat, you can make them with monounsaturated fat, or you can make them with saturated fat. Albeit this is not meat, so it's not something that you would necessarily be eating, Sean, but it is palmitic acid. And what they did show, which is very different than Volek's study, is when you ate a muffin with saturated fat, you did get increased palmitic acid peripherally, and more importantly, there was a huge increase in fat in the liver in the people that were eating more of these. So one group had to eat 3 saturated fat muffins a day, one group 3 monounsaturated fat 3, and that you couldn't tell. It was obviously blinded; they didn't know what they were eating. But there was a very, very strong correlation between peripheral saturated.
Well, I
fat
mean, and again, when we think about beef, for instance, is more monounsaturated fat than it's saturated fat. Most people don't realize that, and so it's this is we're not eating. Yeah, what is, but we're not
but it's still
eating
high
just saturated fat. I mean, this is a problem. This is a study that the Jack study, the state of the art review on saturated fat, and saying that when you're eating whole foods, a steak is just not a bunch of saturated fat. It's monounsaturated fat. It is carnosine and carnitine and choline and all these things that have these, mitigating factors perhaps. And so we can't none of us sit down to eat a bowl of saturated fat. No one sits down to eat a bowl of just carbohydrate. I mean, there's all these different things that we have to realize. Foods are different. A muffin.
This seems like a little bit of obfuscation again, right? He's saying, well, beef actually has more monounsaturated fat than saturated fat. God said it still has a lot of saturated fat. Sean's just kind of glossed over that. But yeah, now he's going to list off all of these other things that are in beef. It's not dealing with the central issue of this is high in saturated fat. There's reason to believe that high saturated fat intake results in poor health outcomes. It's not contending any of that. It's just like it's just muddying the water. It's just like making noise and implying that there's more going on here without actually going down and arguing any of it.
With saturated fat is very different to me than an egg. I mean, or whatever, or a piece of steak. So we have to be mindful of where that saturated fat is coming to, how it's presented. A muffin is going to have very different physiologic effects than a steak will. I mean, that's pretty clear.
So like zooming out big picture here, it kind of seems that a lot of what you're saying, Garth, is yeah, we see that a lot of people might be doing better short term with having meat, but the long term results are yet to be seen. Right. And it looks like so much of the data out there shows that long term consumption of meat, heavy eating meat, is very problematic for people over time. And it sounds like a lot of what you're saying, Sean, is there's a lot lacking in terms of what we have for long-term studies with mostly meat diets, because that's just how this has been designed. We have a lot to learn, but there's also so much benefit that comes from eating meat. It's not just, for example, like the saturated fat that could be problematic. There's a lot more to this that's benefiting people, but plants might also be healthy for people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the guy.
Well, I think he's saying there's no long-term evidence of health benefits of eating lots of meat or eating a carnivore or animal-based diet. There's not a claim that there's no long-term evidence either way, right? Because as we've seen, there is long-term evidence for health problems from eating a lot of meat, which he hasn't contended with. And then, yeah, it's just reiterating, well, there's a bunch of other stuff going on as well. Like, does not actually arguing against the central claim that there's health problems associated with overconsumption of meat, in particular saturated fat. Right, it's like if you were to ask me, did you steal a car last week? And I were to say, well, look, I did a load of things last week, okay? I was out walking around, I went to the supermarket last week, I went and watched a football game last week. It's like, I did all of these things last week. I haven't answered the question. Okay, I haven't denied that I stole a car last week. It's just bringing up a bunch of other stuff which may or may not be relevant. And yeah, I think she has mischaracterized as well what is the state of the evidence regarding long-term health outcomes. He has said that there is no long-term evidence supporting an animal-based diet, but he has not said that the jury's out on that.
Guy out there saying that all plants are killing people. I mean, I want to be very clear about that. I know there are people in the carnivore space that say that. That's not me. I say for select individuals, yes, sometimes dialing that stuff back is helpful. And I see it just only because I see it clinically on a daily basis. I see people with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. When they cut the fiber out of their diet, they do better. And I can't just unsee that. In fact, there is a case series that Harvard is going to publish on inflammatory bowel disease on a carnivore diet. And they're going to show, and they had one, like you said, eating disorder. There's another case series that was published on eating disorders and a carnivore diet. It helps. Yeah. It helps. So again, the question is the long-term stuff. I don't know. I mean, Garth is operating from a position. The Vegan Society was formed in the 1940s. Some guy in England started that. They've got American College of Lifestyle Medicine. They've got the Adventist Health Group. They've got Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. They've got the Kellogg's Corp. I mean, a lot of money has gone into studying these things. We don't have that yet. The beef industry has not published a single carnivore study. And I'm actually asking those guys because it's hard to get the money for this stuff. So I was out there on Rogan shaming those guys for not studying this stuff because I think it needs to be studied. Whatever the outcome, good or bad, we need to know this stuff because if I'm going to continue to promote this stuff, I want to have, a more scientific basis. It's starting to happen. You start with case reports.
And that's a clip.
Good or bad, we need to know this stuff because if I'm going to continue to promote this stuff, I want to have, a more scientific basis. To continue to promote this stuff, I want to have, a more scientific basis.
Okay. So insufficient scientific basis to really carry on promoting a carnivore diet, says the guy who invented and coined the carnivore diet. It's not looking great.
Starting to happen. You start with case reports, you start with observation, then you do.
I feel like he's conceded so much without really being pushed with a self-admittedly pro-carnivore biased mod. There's just is very weak evidence in favor of carnivore diets.
do the observational data, then hopefully you do the interventional trials, which we hopefully will have a couple interventional trials on diabetes this year, because I disagree that meat is causing diabetes. I think it actually causes diabetes to go away, and not just masking the symptoms where the blood glucose goes down, but reversal of retinopathy, reversal of nephropathy. These are things I'm seeing clinically. So I'm like, how do I not only have normalization of blood glucose, the reduction of medications, and reductions in high blood pressure, reductions in nephropathy, reductions in retinopathy? How is that occurring if this is causing the disease? It doesn't make sense to me.
So what you guys can see, what I have up right now, this is going to lead into the next question that I have. Again, being clear about my bias, I'm biased toward eating mostly meat for a healthy lifestyle. So I'm actually asking for your input on this, Garth, for what if you have any, just based off seeing this image probably for the first time, maybe.
What we got here that someone's put in chat. Behavioral characteristics and self-reported health status. Oh yeah, okay, we were looking at this study yesterday. So this is the self-reported subjective health. Oh no, this does have some actual biomarkers measured. Okay, this is useful for me to have. I'll take a look at this. Reported consuming carnivore diet for 14 months, primarily motivated by health reasons. Red meat consumption was reported as daily, often under by 85%. Under 10% reported consuming vegetables, fruits, grains more often than monthly. 7% denied vitamin supplement use. Social media survey was... Oh yeah, okay. I think this is the one we looked at yesterday. Yeah, it's a social media survey from like carnivore forums and stuff. And was Sean Baker involved in this? Is he? Oh, Ludwig. He's mentioned this guy a couple of times.
But what we're looking at is just an example of how a lot of people in the carnivore, the animal-based communities, once they find that they feel better, they start to question kind of the studies that are done overall and what the source and the funding for those studies is. This isn't pertaining to a particular study right now, but this is with regard to the American Heart Association. Basically, what we're looking at is the promoters of what it says here of high carb diets funded by corporate interests. So obviously that's got a little bit of a slant to it, but ultimately these are companies who give money to the American Heart Association, somewhere between 20 to 50% of the American Heart Association.
Stuff like this is not entirely meaningless because obviously, there is some potential for bias for who's funded studies or even just what studies get done. But it's very often overinterpreted that a study being funded by anyone in particular is like proof of bias or proof that it's no good and proof that the results can be thrown out and so on. So I'm very, I'm very skeptical of like this being the basis for chucking out data or criticizing studies. It's a very level one like Reddit tier criticism. It's very easy to scroll to the bottom of the study and say, wow, this is funded by such and such. Right. You need to actually criticize the methodologies of the study. Just saying it's funded by any particular group is not itself evidence of bias. So, yeah.
Associations money comes from these companies. What I'm trying to get at here is the food part up there and the healthcare areas are very confusing for people when we're talking about the American Heart Association. And for anybody who doesn't understand, the American Heart Association is the longest standing voluntary organization that helps to provide dietary guidelines and guidelines in general to prevent heart disease. It was established in like the 1950s. I believe it was after President Eisenhower had a heart attack. And I believe at that time, that was when we started promoting, the American Heart Association started promoting Crisco as the better solution for like fat versus animal fat. Up until that point, animal fat was what people consumed in America, majority of the people at least. And so looking at this, we see kind of like where funding is coming from for the American Heart Association. And what's curious about the American Heart Association, as an example, is that
he funded this study. Okay, interesting. Again, not evidence that it's bad in itself, right? But I mean, there's plenty of other reasons to think that this study is no good.
they used to say that 300 milligrams a day for cholesterol was like the guiding light. You need to have like no more than 300 milligrams a day. And also that saturated fat was very, very harmful for people. That was kind of why we always had I think it was since the 1980s, 90s, it was like low fat, basically don't eat eggs, all that stuff. Well, interestingly enough, in the last few years, the American Heart Association very quietly kind of like took those off the page, off of their website, but there was no PR statement about that. There was no like, update anywhere. Yet that's up until that point, the guidelines that they were giving the entire country, what's in schools, what's in hospitals was, very low saturated fat, like under 300 milligrams of cholesterol. Those recommendations just very quietly went away. And then you pull up these kinds of companies that are working with them. And so that's to say the people in the animal-based carnivore space are very suspicious of why these studies for plant-based, let's say, or even vegan, who's funding them and how much that matters. The question is the news media bought and owned by plant-based narrative? And if so, is there proof of this? Examples like
well, let me just respond to this chart, because I mean, I buy meat from Costco and I see they're on there. There's Whole Foods on there, so they do. There's people that supply meat to their. So I'm not like, oh my God, it's all carbs. Honestly, I mean, I see the drug companies on it, and a lot of studies are funded by drug companies. They don't open source their data a lot of times. So I'm more concerned about the drug companies than the fact that, Big Broccoli is paying.
Wouldn't you hope that drug companies are funding health research? Wouldn't you want that to be happening? Like, that is what they're for. Of course. Right? That is literally what drug companies are for, to do research on drugs. It looks like Sean's saying this is not really a story of, funding by big carb necessarily, but I mean, again, I think just the whole like, oh, this is who's funding it is very surface level. It's not entirely. We've got Tyson on here as well. Look, so it's not entirely irrelevant. Danone, right? This is dairy. It's not entirely irrelevant, but it's very often overinterpreted. And in particular, like this is not even. You've got meat and dairy companies on here, so I don't think it's really even showing what they want to show here, what they want to claim.
Paying the American Heart Association, to be honest, but I mean. Yeah, it's a problem. There are conflicts of interest. There are ethical conflicts of interest. There are financial conflicts of interest. I think it's rife throughout, medical research. I think it's rife throughout nutritional research. It is a problem. Do you dismiss completely on face the data? I don't think you can quite do that, but you can at least have a skeptical eye, and you want to see independent, reproducible studies done multiple. And like my view is, if I'm the guy putting out carnivore studies, you'd be correct to suspect that I have a bias there, because I do. I mean, clearly. And I think that, one of the things that we have to, be mindful of is the fact that there are still good researchers that are doing good data. You can look at some of this. I mean, a lot of people point to the NIH because it's supposed to be unbiased. I'm not sure how completely unbiased it is. I will say that Garth can pull up a bunch of studies just because they've been funded. And again, if you've got Adventist Health, they're a multi-billion-dollar organization. You've got, other companies that have said, hey, we think this is the right way we're going to fund the studies. And we know that studies that are funded 83% of the time they agree with whoever funds them in a lot of ways. So there is some bias there. I don't think we can ignore that. But I mean, again, at the end of the day, you still have to look at the data. And I don't discount what the data says. I might say, well, they didn't ask the right question, or the group they're studying isn't the group I'm concerned with, right?
True. Surprisingly enlightened take, yes. Having been funded by any particular group is not evidence that the study is bad or that it can be thrown out or disregarded. Yeah. Well, I guess a stop clock is right twice a day.
Exactly. So, Lauren, there's no, like these groups, so funding American Heart Association isn't funding research, all right? Research, like when I go to do a research study, I've got to get independent research funding. I don't get it from American Heart. You get it from National Institute of Health. So these are NIH grants, or a lot of times you go to private funds, like people create funds, like I'm trying to get a private fund from a private group right now. In any good study, if you look at the study, it'll say funds were provided.
Hey, welcome back, Voldemort. Good to see you. Welcome back.
But the group had absolutely no influence whatsoever in design of the article. I think Sean probably hit on it. When I look at bias, more times I look at the researcher than I do at the actual study of who funded it, because oftentimes us researchers have way more bias from a personal standpoint than the industry going in. If you want to look at money spent towards research, Beef Checkoff.
Do I? Oh, I do.
You know
yeah,
what Beef Checkoff
I definitely do. Yeah.
Oh, you do, but I'm just saying, Lauren. So Beef Checkoff is huge. So every meat industry provides money towards basically a beef marketing program, and they actually will fund many studies. Lane Norton, who I think I like Lane Norton a lot. We've argued many times. I think he probably hates me, but he's I think a pretty solid in the middle guy, and just about every study he's ever published has been funded by beef. When you look at the studies that I quote, whether it's Adventist Health, whether it's a Harvard Nurses study, whether it's UK Biobank, whether it's the Global Burden of Disease, none of those have got independent funding. They're all government funded by a variety of researchers that have no interest. They're not vegan, they're not meat eaters. They're just like, what's the answer to this really big question? They're more interested in getting tenure than what the study shows. There's a reason that saturated fat has been argued, and that's because, in fact, there was a huge World Health Consortium recently that looked over the saturated fat data and said, without any
The mod looks so dejected. She brought up the spooky funding chart about how Big Carb was funding all the health studies, and literally both sides of the debate just went, yeah, that's not really true, and it doesn't really matter. Oh. Alright, carry on, I guess.
Slight, even possible retraction, they are doubling down on the fact that saturated fat is related with heart disease, and they're basing it a bunch on metagenetics. Now, do you know what Mendelian randomization is, Lauren? I don't know.
I do, but if you wouldn't mind share, like really make it simple for everybody.
Yeah, so it's not a simple concept, so it's hard for people to understand. But we say that that saturated fat causes a rise in LDL, and that LDL causes heart disease. Now, there's been this recent thing. In fact, one of Voleg's studies said, now undoubtedly saturated fat is not associated with heart disease. Okay, so even the Cochrane study says saturated fat is associated with heart disease. So how does Voleg say that saturated fat is not associated with heart disease? This is where funding becomes an issue, and this is where bias becomes an issue. Okay, so the biggest study on this ever this started the whole debate, was the Siri-Torino study. Siri-Torino study, I think 2012, 2014, somewhere around there. And the debate over whether saturated fat causes heart disease. Because that's been if you ask any cardiologist, oh yeah, saturated fat, heart disease. And so Siri Torino said, wait a second, let's look at saturated fat and let's look at heart disease. And they did not find an association with saturated fat and heart disease. And this was a meta-analysis. Okay, how is that possible? Well, one simple thing that the average layperson wouldn't understand, but a researcher would understand. And it happens with something called controls. So if you're trying to decide what causes heart disease, you want to take out independent risk factors of heart disease. So for instance, obesity is an independent risk factor for heart disease. So you're not going to have in your group that you're studying really overweight people. So they moved really overweight people. But here's a catch. They took out all the people with high cholesterol. So they controlled for cholesterol. Now that's a problem because saturated fat causes heart disease, not in and of itself, but because it raises cholesterol. So if you're taking out the fact that saturated fat raises cholesterol and you're taking out those people where it raised cholesterol, what you're left with is a genetic group of people that aren't as affected by saturated fat and they don't raise cholesterol. And now you could say saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease. It's called over-adjustment bias. And it is wrought throughout the research. I could easily create a study where I create over-adjustment bias. The other thing I could do is I could create a study where, there's a study called the Women's Health Initiative, and it was a kind of a low-fat versus low-carb type look. And when you look at it, the control group that was supposed to be eating higher fat had something called a Hawthorne bias, or basically a healthy user bias, or they wanted to impress people. So they actually ended up eating less fat. We wanted them to eat a certain amount of fat. They ate less fat. Meanwhile, the group that was supposed to eat less fat, the actual experimental group, didn't drop their fat very much. And so control and experimental group ate almost the same amount of fat. So you can't draw any conclusions from that, and yet they do. The conclusion they draw is the low-fat group didn't have a difference. Do you understand that bias? So there's all kinds of these biases, and really what we need is a randomized controlled trial. But how do we do a randomized controlled trial that lasts a lifetime? Enter metagenetics or Mendelian randomization. What Mendelian randomization says is there's certain people out there that have certain genetic predispositions. And they may have a predisposition, for instance, to have very high LDL. So they are basically randomized into having high LDL. There may be a group that has a genetic predisposition to having very low LDL. And in fact, if you really want to get into the science, we could look at specific receptors that drugs specifically look at. And you should look at the Mendelian randomization consortium. But we could go specifically to receptors. We could say the receptor that PCSK9 is affecting does have a genetic randomization process where some people don't make that receptor, some people do. And what we have found just undoubtedly with Mendelian randomization is that if you have a high cholesterol level, you have a higher rate of heart disease. And Mendelian randomization has driven that home. And it's also driven home the fact that the mechanism of actions, the saturated fat to LDL, is a driver for our number one killer. So Mendelian randomization has been a very strong driver towards keeping saturated fat in the recommendations. Now, the reason they've gone quiet on cholesterol is cholesterol doesn't affect cholesterol very much. So eating cholesterol, we used to think affects cholesterol levels. Now we know it's mainly saturated fat. Now, if I eat an egg...
Yeah, there's not meant to be dietary cholesterol. I believe there's actually been some more recent studies in this debate, which is a year ago, which has somewhat reopened this debate about whether dietary cholesterol increases blood cholesterol. But yeah, there's it was primarily dietary saturated fat that increases blood cholesterol.
My cholesterol level will go sky high. If Sean eats an egg, it won't. And that has to do with the fact that it's not a linear progression. So at a certain amount of, there are cholesterol receptors in the gut lining, and you can saturate those. So if you eat a lot of eggs and then you do a study and you give these people 5 more eggs, they're not going to raise their cholesterol very much. And most of the public eats a pretty good amount of cholesterol. But it's a kind of a long-winded way to say there are reasons for the saturated fat, and it's science, it's not industry. This has nothing to do with it. There is no big carb industry. Well, there's a sugar industry that pays for studies, but there's no big broccoli, there's no big kale.
Yeah, well, I mean there's big processed food. I mean, you look at Nestle and Danone and all these companies.
That's interesting. I feel like inclined to re-listen to the second part of what he said there. Because I was making some notes on the first part about the over-adjustment bias. So he's saying in this particular review, or in this particular meta-analysis, they took out people with high cholesterol when studying whether saturated fat was linked to increased risk of heart disease. And he's saying, well, it's no good doing that because that's the mechanism by which saturated fat is linked to heart disease. So you're just left with people who are genetically predisposed to have lower cholesterol. It'd be like if you were trying to study whether drinking too much alcohol causes early death, but you're going to control for people with liver problems. You'd say, well, no, hang on. The liver problems caused by the alcohol is what causes the early death. So if you take out all of those people, then yeah, you're going to see the effect missing. But let me rewind like a minute here just to listen to the second part. Oh, look at that. This is the most replayed section.
What we need is a randomized controlled trial, but how do we do a randomized controlled trial that lasts a lifetime? Enter metagenetics or Mendelian randomization. What Mendelian randomization says is there's certain people out there that have certain genetic predispositions, and they may have a predisposition, for instance, to have very high LDL. So they are basically randomized into having high LDL. There may be a group that has a genetic predisposition to having very low LDL. And in fact, if you really want to get into the science, we could look at specific receptors that drugs specifically look at. And you should look at the Mendelian randomization consortium. But we could go to specifically to receptors. We could say the receptor that PCSK9 is affecting does have a genetic randomization process where some people don't make that receptor, some people do. And what we have found just undoubtedly with Mendelian randomization is that if you have a high cholesterol level, you have a higher rate of heart disease. And Mendelian randomization has driven that home. And it's also driven home the fact that the mechanism of actions, the saturated fat to LDL, is a driver for our number one killer. So Mendelian randomization has been a very strong driver towards keeping saturated fat in the recommendations. Now, the reason they've gone quiet on cholesterol is cholesterol doesn't affect cholesterol very much. So eating cholesterol, we used to think affects cholesterol levels. Now we know it's mainly saturated fat. Now, if I eat an egg, my cholesterol level will go sky.
Hey, Andrew, good to see you. No, we haven't. That's a good question. Good thought. My assumption is with this kind of thing that basically people going in with either kind of bias at the start are more likely to see their guy as having won the debate, right? So people are not. Presumably most of the people watching this have one view or the other going into it. But yeah, I think it's useful to... Well, I'm watching this because I'm debating this animal-based diets guy in about a week and a half. So I'm picking up some of the studies and some of the talking points from here. But yeah, no. I don't know whether this, like, engaging with this kind of stuff is, yeah, for sure, myself as well, right? Yeah, I don't know whether engaging with this kind of stuff is, the thing is there will be some neutrals, right, who are on the fence, and then they might form an opinion in either direction. But okay, I'm honestly, I'm not sure if I've completely absorbed the point about the Mendelian randomization trials here. Is something to do with controlling for genetic differences in the link between saturated fat and LDL cholesterol. But I don't want to rewatch it a third time, so let me just get back to where we were, and I'll make a note to look into that.
And these processed foods,
yeah.
in many cases, and we know there's studies that show that people that tend to eat more plant-based tend to eat more processed food. That is known. And so, you know, the sort of the perhaps, you know, goal might be to get people to eat more processed food by having them cut back on eating meat, because we know what happens when we remove butter from the diet. People eat more margarine. When we remove meat from the diet, they eat more. Unfortunately, they're not eating lentils and beans. They're eating more processed food. That's just what happens. And
what am I going to say? My favorite point to make: plant-based meat is indeed healthier than meat. And there's pretty good evidence of this, which I've discussed at length over on LinkedIn. So here's the processed food obfuscation, and we just looked at that Rauber study about how they've grouped in plant-based meat alternatives in the same category with a bunch of things like donuts, which are obviously unhealthy, and then put out a press release saying plant-based meat's unhealthy. So I wonder if that's something Garth's going to challenge. We'll see.
There's some market forces that want to drive that, in my view. Mendelian randomization studies are not bulletproof. There are some concerns around you know, what does a genetic defect actually do? You know, we've talked about with pleomorphic effects of statin drugs for a long time. You know, it's like, is it LDL reduction, or is it, you know, inflammation reduction that's been going on? So there's, you know, even though Mendelian randomization studies kind of cut through some of the confounders that we have, and just like you mentioned, sort of over accounting for confounders, you can under account for them. You can basically design a study to show whatever you want, depending how much weight you give to these different confounding variables. You'd mentioned in that Santorini study, they excluded the overweight people. But again, the study, the meta-analysis of a randomized controlled trial that Sotomoto just put out there shows that in a low-carb case, the people that are the leanest have the highest cholesterol, right? So this is kind of backwards to what we're excluding. So I would argue, again, who's the population we're talking about? Are we talking about the general westernized diet where people are obese and insulin resistant, and yes, probably eating more fat, more calories, more saturated fat is going to drive higher LDL, and perhaps in that situation when they perhaps are oxidizing it more likely, and that's leading to cardiovascular disease. I mean, it's funny when you talk about a lot of meat, because the average American, like beef, for instance, the average American, we have about 52 pounds a year. That works out to about 2 ounces of beef per person per day. That's not a lot of food. That's a very small amount. I mean, 2 ounces would not even get me across the room. And so when we're talking about 70% of our diet come from processed food, ultra processed food, 2 ounces of beef is not significant in that case. And in fact, most of the saturated, like I mentioned, most of our saturated fat is more dairy than anything. I mean, there's more dairy consumption. There certainly is straight up meat consumption. And most of the meat we're eating is coming in the form of hamburgers and hot dogs and lasagnas and prepackaged meals and things like that. So again, very different populations.
So Sean, with this, you have a kind of a theme on your social media where you talk a lot about just this food industry and how it's bought and owned in a lot of different ways. I'm going to pull up just an example of one of these. It's just one of your more recent videos here. And you don't need to go into like a full thing.
I'll just put the caveat,
but
the social media is kind of for entertainment purposes only in many ways, you know, I mean, but anyway, what am I saying here? I don't know.
Well, sure. And I mean, I think, you know.
Interesting. Okay. Interesting to note then, when in conversation with plant-based Dr. Sean Baker, not really willing to stand by what he's saying on social media. Interesting.
You know, regardless of whether it's for entertainment or not, obviously there's kind of a shock factor to a lot of things, right? But you're putting it out there what you believe. So ideally you stand behind it, which I know you do. You knew it was corrupt, but it's worse than what you thought. Do you recall?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so again, we you know, Garth brought this up. Kevin,
ideally you stand behind it, she said. He's like, nah, not really. I don't really. It's just for entertainment.
All metabolic ward study. You look at the press coverage that study got, right? That study was CNN, you know, Fox News, 90 news outlets picked it up. You know, you can look at it on the altmetric score, which tells how the impact that the study has had. The reanalysis, which basically, may lead to the retraction of the study, has gotten the reanalysis, which has had zero meat.
Just want to show off. Look at this beautiful lunch that my beautiful wife just brought me. A little tofu scramble, some refried beans, avocado. Lovely.
Media outlets that have covered that, even though it's got the same altmetric score, even though people are just as interested in this study as the other one, but the media has decided we're not going to talk about this, which is kind of an interesting sort of dichotomy. You've got one that is pro don't eat meat versus one that's saying, wait a minute, that's wrong. And one gets all the media coverage and one doesn't get any. And so I think that's kind of interesting to see that.
The study, all right, it was NIH funded, right? So this is not like and Kevin Hall Kevin Hall invited me to barbecue one night. This is not a vegan proponent. And in fact, he's still not a vegan proponent. He's it's weird because his interpretation of the data is not necessarily pro plants at all. Him and I got into quite an argument the other day online because he points out the drop in A1C in the meat eating group, which doesn't mean anything to me. They were eating less sugars, so they're going to have a drop in A1C, but they were more insulin resistant. Regardless, I don't know that your listeners really care about this, but this is not a biased guy. This is about one of the most respected nutritional researchers in the world doing a study that was about as well controlled. I will agree with you on one thing with this study is I wish there was a washout period, but he just couldn't afford to have these people leave the ward and come back. And because they had what Ludwig wants to do is look at the data of whether or not the way the study was organized is there were 40 people, 20 people started with a low carb, right. 20 people started with the plant-based, and then they switched. And what the study didn't do is say, how did the switch affect? And so that's what Ludwig's trying to do. In other words, if you started with a high carb, and then went to a low carb, is that different than if you started with a low carb and went to a high carb?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Andrew. 2 Cokes instead of listening to the stream, true.
Showed was about a 3-fold difference more than the effect of what the study showed. So, it was impactful and significantly impactful. And that's why they published the reanalysis. And I think it's something that says, hey, maybe the conclusion.
Have they sent that to the letter?
No, they published a study. They published a study that was published that was all over Twitter. The altmetric score exceeded what the Kevin Hall altmetric scores. And I'm not sure, Garth, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with altmetric scores. It's journal impact factor. And the second study had a greater altmetric score, more people interested in it, but zero news coverage, which is it's just interesting to see that.
But on that, Sean, really, can you just very clearly, like for people who haven't seen that video, what was published and what was not published is what you're getting at.
Both studies were published. The initial study that Kevin Hall, and I don't discount that Kevin Hall is a good, well-respected researcher. So is David Ludwig, by the way. David Ludwig, because
since they're not really appealing to any data here on the question of whether there's more media coverage of pro-plant-based things or pro-animal-based things, I'll just say that from my perspective, again, this debate's a year ago, but it seems like there's plenty of media coverage of anti-plant-based things lately. Since we're just going off vibes in either case, right? I don't think that... frankly, I didn't think this was a particularly interesting part of the conversation, but there we go.
I know David. I talk to him not infrequently. In fact, I'm helping him to organize another study. But he will not take any industry funding. He is like, I will never take industry funding. He wants to be as pure as a driven snow in that regard. So he's a very ethical guy. And the initial study that Kevin produced got a lot of media hoopla. It was it was talked by all these media outlets. That study was published in 2021. The reanalysis was done just at the end of 2023.
And quickly, what what did that study show in 2021? So
It
people
showed
understand.
that people that were on a plant-based low-fat diet lost more weight than people on a low-carb, high-fat animal-based diet, right?
Well, actually, the animal group actually lost more weight, but all of their weight was lean mass. None of it was fat. Whereas the plant-based
I'll have to look at
lost more fat.
the results, but it was basically plant-based. Yeah, plant-based tended to be better on that outcome for whatever metric we're looking at. However, the reanalysis showed it didn't really matter which diet you ate. It mattered what diet you ate first, because if you ate low carb first, you had a better outcome because there's a carryover effect. So that's why you have a washout period. That's why you wait a month or 2 months. And so whatever diet went first was the one that ultimately showed the best results. So if you went low carb first, your overall results were better. If you went high carb first, your results were worse based on, weight gain and C-peptide levels. The C-peptide levels actually predicted very clearly what the weight gain or weight loss was going to be. C-peptide is a proxy for insulin. For every molecule of insulin we make, there's a C-peptide molecule that goes there, and it's considered a better marker because insulin is often sequestered in the liver and it's metabolized very quickly and doesn't hang around very long, whereas C-peptide is a much better marker for that. So the reanalysis, basically what I'm saying is the reanalysis got crickets, whereas the initial study got all kinds of fanfare. And it was like, is there an inherent bias by that? Is it,
Okay, so you're saying that the initial study where it was in favor of plant-based is one that got republished basically after the secondary study came out, whatever.
No, it just got more media coverage and got it. And in fact, it was interesting when the second study came out, when the reanalysis study came out, an additional 30 media outlets picked up the initial
the mod's really not following much, is she?
Study and still didn't cover the reanalysis, which was very bizarre to me, that they would re-engage a study that's 2 years old.
I was eating my lunch and I know what he's talking about.
And not talk about the reanalysis, which I thought was weird. I mean, again, I don't really want to dwell on conspiracy theories and this sort of stuff. I mean, I think Garth wants to let's just talk about the science here. I do think there's more support for plant-based in general. I think people think we're going to save the planet, we're going to save some cows, and I think there's some bias in that. Even in the dietary guidelines, they're starting to let that creep in. What do we think is better for the environment? And I think that's unfortunate because I think nutrition should be nutrition, and there should not be some ethical bias to that, which I think.
Yeah, that dates it, right? That dates it for the current admin. Yeah, the problem with the US dietary guidelines, there's too much consideration of what's ethical and good for the environment. Well, it certainly fixed that.
I think unfortunately there is in many cases.
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I testified at a few years ago for the USDA for the dietary guidelines. I was flabbergasted at the amount of lobbyists at that thing. There were a handful of doctors, and the rest was just lobbyists. And it was very full of meat, dairy, and egg. I mean, it was a huge meat, dairy, and egg constituency. I mean, it was really amazing. And this goes way back. I mean, the whole dietary guidelines. If you go back to the McGovern era, where they had
77.
Do you know about
when he
the
said,
McGovern
I don't have time to make decisions.
Committee?
I'm not a researcher. I don't have time. Senators have to make a decision right now. Yeah.
I don't know what that is. Can you share what that is?
So basically what this was is the Senate had a select committee. Basically, they started out looking at malnutrition. They wanted to look at malnutrition in America, and they found that we didn't have a lot of malnutrition, but we had overnutrition. This was the time where heart disease was just soaring. And they held the series of committee meetings, and they were very contentious. And it was a very good example of industry getting involved. And meat, dairy, and egg were huge in it, but so was sugar. So was the sugar industry. And basically, they recommended, they made some pretty, I thought, very decent recommendations. They said we need to eat less meat. You might not think that was good, but they were pretty good about not getting into the weeds of like saturated fat or this or that. But the meat industry got really pissed at that. McGovern was from North Dakota. He was voted out. They stopped talking about, they basically made it where you couldn't make any recommendations on whole foods. You could only make it on the parts. This is where we started getting into macronutrients, because we stopped talking about whole foods and we started talking about macronutrients. And this is where the whole low fat craze came. So this is where they said, okay, we should eat more, but it should be lean meat. And people said, what is lean meat? Well, it's low fat. How do we get low fat? All of a sudden you've got Nabisco low fat snack wells. And that's how we never went low fat, by the way. We never went on a low fat diet. We said we did, but we just ate more processed food, as Sean alluded to earlier. And that kind of really messed up, I think, our nutrition discussions. But there is definitely.
Hey J2, welcome back. Someone's bought a membership to veganism. What does that entail? You get stickers?
Bias. There are senators getting taken out to dinner by different food organizations. I don't think in the world where Sean and I live, there's a lot, there's no big plant lobby. Most of the lobbies are for big companies that are making processed type.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And yeah, I think McGovern was from South Dakota. Just I know that because I'm dealing with the state of South Dakota to get some funding, and they said they want to make up for their knucklehead McGovern because they felt like he kind of caused some problems. So it's interesting, but yeah.
Take it easy, VT. Hope to see you back.
Also problems for ranchers.
They're trying to say, hey, look, we think we've been vilified unnecessarily. And I do, again, I think Garth and I would both agree that the ultra-processed food is a real problem. And I think where we disagree is probably around meat. I think that's a fair statement.
Yeah, I'll tell you one place where I really got shocked with that was, okay, if you look at the EPIC database or if you look at the Heidelberger, these are different studies that were the big studies looking at vegans versus vegetarians. They've got a couple of versions of EPIC Oxford. It started out as the Oxford, and then it got taken over by the EPIC. EPIC was a multi-country study looking at diet and disease, but they went and they looked specifically in Oxford because Oxford had a large proportion, not a large, but a significant proportion of vegans. EPIC Oxford was interesting because if you look at the vegetarians in the EPIC Oxford, the EPIC Oxford, in just about any study you look at, higher plant-based diets associated with lower colorectal cancer. And that might make sense. Maybe it doesn't to you, but it does to me, except in EPIC Oxford. And they started looking at EPIC Oxford. EPIC Oxford, there's definitely benefits to being plant-based. But when you look, there's a specific study that compares EPIC Oxford to the Adventist, because there's a big difference between Adventist Health and EPIC Oxford. When you start looking at EPIC Oxford, and the vegans are getting 25 grams of fiber a day, that's not much at all. The vegans in the Adventist Health are getting 45 grams of fiber a day. You start looking at sugar-sweetened beverages, there's more sugar-sweetened beverages. If you start looking at all these different factors, you notice that the vegans in the EPIC Oxford are not really following a healthy diet. Well, what Harvard did is they said, we need to stop this vegan versus vegetarian. We need to have healthy eating indices. And there's Mediterranean indices, like a scorecard where we take a group of people, we look at what they eat, and then we make a score for, are they eating towards a Mediterranean diet? And they looked specifically at plant-based in their nurses' health and in their health professions. And they said, okay, let's look at plant-based index. Does having a high plant-based index, not saying that you're vegetarian, vegan, but you're eating quite a bit of plants, does that make you healthier? It does, but not very healthy. Okay, well, let's make up an unhealthy plant-based index. Now, if you're high on an unhealthy plant-based index, meaning you're not eating meat, but you're eating a lot of processed food, are you still healthy? No, you actually have more heart disease and more risk. Now, what if you have a healthy plant-based index? Okay, now if we did a healthy plant-based index, we're actually eating fruit, vegetables, beans, etc. Now you're extremely healthy, and there's a huge drop in risk of heart disease and risk of diabetes.
I'd like to know what that consisted of. Because you're talking about fiber intake. This is one of the areas where plant-based meat is healthier than meat. Right? You'll increase your fiber intake if you switch to plant-based meat. Now, of course, you could still have an unhealthy plant-based diet, right? Obviously, there's enough sweets and sugar-sweetened beverages and all the rest of it that you could be just loading up on and be following a vegan diet, but for it to be unhealthy, right? So again, it's irking me a little bit there. He says processed foods in such a blanket way, because there's going to be a lot of variation within that. But yeah, let's just see what study this is.
You start looking at sugar-sweetened beverages, there's more sugar-sweetened beverages. If you start looking at all these different factors, you notice that the vegans in the Epic Oxford are not really following a healthy diet. Well, what Harvard did is they said, we need to stop this vegan versus vegetarian. We need
Harvard cohort study.
to be healthy. No, you actually have more heart disease and more risk. Now, what if you have a healthy plant-based index? Okay, now if we did a healthy plant-based index, we're actually eating fruit, vegetables, beans, etc. Now you're extremely healthy, and there's a huge drop in risk of heart disease and risk of diabetes. So even in the plant-based world, that's why I get very careful about saying vegan. I never tell people to eat vegan because I run an obesity clinic. I see vegans in my obesity clinic, and they're eating brownies, and nowadays. You could eat anything vegan that you could eat meat, and that's not healthy. And so I think we do definitely agree that unprocessed food.
You mentioned there's a healthy plant-based
killer.
index. There's no such thing as a healthy meat-based index, and so that's what I'm calling for.
Okay, maybe there's a reason for that. Okay, now obviously again, within plant-based alternatives, if you're having a ton of cheeseburgers, it's probably not going to be the healthiest diet. But the question should be whether it's healthier than the animal products that they're replacing. Brownies, all stuff like this, right? I think this is more what it's about, where you can have a lot of very sugary foods, a lot of things which are obviously unhealthy, like, vegan or not. I'd really like to know when this was, because it says a year ago, but there's now at least 2 systematic reviews showing improved cardiometabolic heart health markers for swapping out meat for plant-based meat. So I'd like to hear Garth talk more about this. Again, talking about processed foods broadly, it like mixes a lot of stuff into the same category. But yeah, main point, I'll keep saying it, plant-based meat is healthier than meat.
Let's stop studying the standard American diet and calling a Happy Meal, the diet that I'm promoting, because, it would.
And that would be fascinating, actually. I would like to see a evaluation, because in any of the healthy eating indices, a lot of times, so Harvard kind of came up with the DASH score. I don't know if you know the DASH score, Lauren, but basically with DASH, they were looking at. No, that was a Harvard creation, okay. And it was actually done, DASH diet, yeah. They were looking at hypertension specifically. So it was a diet for hypertension. And they noticed that people that ate more plants tended to have lower hypertension. In fact, at the time they said, well, the ultimate diet would be a vegetarian diet, but the key author, Sachs, said, well, we can't tell people to go vegetarian. They won't do it. It's too extreme. So let's come up with this DASH diet. They've got a DASH score, and if you look at the DASH score and you look at the data on people that follow a DASH diet
That's so interesting. Even at the level of the scientists conducting these studies, there's like some pragmatic considerations, which I wonder if they had any evidence and reason to believe that people would be more likely to follow this diet than if they would say a vegetarian diet. So saying that the evidence was actually supporting that vegetarian diet would be the healthiest diet, but the authors said, well, people are going to think that's too extreme, so let's come up with some alternative.
Are more consistent with the DASH diet by scoring, tend to have lower heart disease and lower hypertension, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all of these indices, to Sean's point, all of these indices consider meat bad, even unprocessed meat. So there should be an indice, I think, where you're eating a lot of plants but you get points for unprocessed. Sorry, Lauren, but I can't ever give points for your bacon. Bacon, processed meat comes up bad in every single study that's ever been. It is so dramatically bad. But unprocessed meat.
Yeah, but I feel so good. The vibes are so good. The vibes are immaculate, and people around me like eating meat as well, and they say that they feel better as well. I'm glad that you called out the bacon.
Okay, let's come up with a healthy score that includes vegetables and fruits, but has a healthy meat. It would be interesting to see how a healthy meat-based index does to a plant-based index. That hasn't been done.
There's a lot of controversy around bacon actually within the animal-based community, carnivore community anyways. There's a lot of people who are for, I mean, Sean, you could speak to that probably way better than I can.
I personally don't eat much bacon. I think it tastes damn good, but I rarely eat it. I just don't even, I really don't want to eat it. It's not that I'm worried about it particularly.
Oh no. Just like, can't someone tell me that bacon's healthy? Within the carnivore community, there's a lot of debate and controversy around whether bacon is healthy. I mean, I guess the carnivore community is not that concerned with scientific evidence, so yeah, they probably have a great time debating all of that.
Particularly, but I just don't have a desire to eat. It's kind of weird how things change. I mean, Garth, I would push back a little bit on the processed meat. There have been a few studies. I mean, studies come out of Asia showing that, you know, there's reviews showing that processed meats don't really seem to matter that much. And I know you submitted one study.
Oh, boy.
Yeah,
you'd have to show me that.
There's a study called,
I
think it's like Colorectal Cancer, Red Meat, the Asian Perspective. I think that's roughly what the title is. And I mean, granted, it was...
Garth's getting kind of mic cucked here. I guess he's just on some village laptop mic, or possibly even the headphones sometimes have a mic. These guys have both got the Chad Shaw mics, and it looks like Sean worked out how to use it in this one as well, which he hadn't done in the militant vegan debate that we watched.
It was published out of Korea, and they did analysis because they said most of the studies that have been done study Western diets, and they don't have as many studies on red meat and Asian population, because I think the way the Asian populations consume meat
is just going between processed meat and red meat there. I don't know if that was a misspeak or he's talking about something else now.
It's not in the context of hamburgers and French fries. It's probably alongside, you know, maybe a stir fry or something like that. I think that the way they consume their meat is very different than perhaps the way we consume our meat, which is hot dogs, hamburgers, lasagnas and things like that. So, but yeah, they concluded that it didn't matter what the temperature was. It didn't matter what that's not it. It's another study. I'd have to look it up. Unfortunately, I didn't think about it ahead of time, but it's there. I can find it and send it to you at some point.
The wheels kind of fell off that one. Garth was like, oh, really? You have to send me that. I haven't seen that. There's a lot of studies showing that processed meat's bad. Sean gets halfway through describing it, and then he's like, actually, nah, never mind.
But no, I forget what we were talking about now. Well, anyway, let's go on to
Oh, come on.
the next topic then. Yeah.
Wait, what? Literally never seen something quite like that. He's just backed off it mid-sentence. That's quite something. Is Garth going to push on it and say... He's just sort of put out, like, oh, there's actually some doubt about whether processed meat's bad for you. Gets halfway through the explanation and then just, like, completely flops. Hopefully Garth says, okay, so processed meat probably is bad for you then?
Just talk about processed.
True, Race Lever. Are we witnessing carnivore brain fog? I think so.
So, I mean,
yeah, I would agree. I would agree that the epidemiologic studies that show processed meat is higher than non-processed. Even the World WHO's proclamation in 2015 said class 1 for processed, class 2 for unprocessed. And
yeah, kind of true, Race. I think Garth is much more polite than is really warranted. I mean, fortunately, Sean manages to own himself several times in this debate. which kind of saves Garth some of the hard work. But yeah, he's not really going for the kill shots where somebody else could. He's not doing dunks and clip farming. Yeah, very well, good faith, but also like could be more aggressive, I would say. There's been several times in here where Sean's like completely fallen apart, and yeah, I would have liked to see someone go a little bit harder on that. You'll notice, by the way, this is what I've searched for. Yeah, the Mike Morgan is a problem. True. I've searched for Sean Baker Nutrivore debate, which is what Medicine Vegan mentioned when we were watching the other day. But I don't think this is that, right? The Nutrivore thing's a different thing. Is that right?
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to watch that as well at some point.
I mean, I think there's some. Yeah.
Right. And the one thing I will say is in the Asian studies, like the unprocessed meat tends to be.
But no, I forget what we were talking about now. Well, anyway, let's go on to the next topic then. Yeah.
Well, we're just talking about processed meat. So, I mean, processed
yeah, I would agree. I would agree that the epidemiologic studies that show processed meat is higher than enough.
Yeah, Mike Mogged again there. He's really, like, Sean's just able to talk over Garth completely. And, like, yeah, there's a self-admittedly biased mod, so she's not really going to say, let him finish.
Unprocessed. Even the World WHO's proclamation in 2015 said class 1 for processed, class 2 for unprocessed. And, yeah, I mean, I think there's some. Yeah.
Right. And the one thing I will say is in the Asian studies, like the unprocessed meat tends to be associated with cancer and mortality in Western populations.
So you wonder why that is.
I don't know if that's
why
what you're
is that?
referring to.
I mean, that's a question. Why do we see these dichotomies in different populations?
Yeah. But that's more on unprocessed. I've never seen a good way.
Also, middle of talking about like cookies and brownies are obviously unhealthy. My wife brings me a beautiful plant-based cookie.
And when you could go into mechanistic, and we haven't talked much about mechanistic, but it worries. Look, the other thing to look at, which is interesting, I don't know, we're going long, but I'm very interested in the aging.
Yeah
I'm very interested in aging because I'm aging. And I want to know how not to age. And so this has become a big issue. Now, this is a very mechanistic study because to study this from a non-mechanistic standpoint, you got to study a whole lifetime, right? So we got to look at mechanisms of aging. And funny enough, they're looking at dog mechanisms right now because they could study dogs because they have a shorter life expectancy. And the number one thing they're looking at, have you guys seen these crazy people that are getting into aging and they're taking rapamycin?
Not for me. I got to tell you, I don't know what your thoughts are. Yeah, good.
Not for me either, but well, funny enough, I got the rapamycin because I was interested and I took it and I got sick because it is an immunosuppressant. But and I never get sick. I was like, oh my god, it's the rapamycin. But people, like
Sinclair,
what's his name?
Is it Attia? Peter Attia, Sinclair.
Not Sinclair.
Yeah, right.
Attia. So Attia has been taking rapamycin. So how does rapamycin work? Right. It works by blocking mTOR. And works on this mTOR pathway, which has become the central pathway that we're looking at aging.
Well,
what stimulates mTOR?
One of the things, insulin also stimulates mTOR, and calories stimulate mTOR as well.
A lot of things.
So, I mean, it's not just leucine, right?
Yeah, calories do stimulate. Exercise stimulates it. But and you want some mTOR, otherwise you won't grow muscle. But too much mTOR and blocking mTOR seems to be related with aging. And so my concern with protein has been that if we overconsume protein, we're going to overstimulate aging. Now, this is way mechanistic. It doesn't have anything really substantial for us to talk about except for theory. But I will bring up the fact that when you look at some of the mechanistic studies when it comes to meat, I worry about the increasing IGF-1. I worry about the increase in mTOR. I worry about advanced glycolylated end products. Because especially with the way you cook meat, you kind of brought that up, but it has been shown that the way you cook meat can have a big effect. Those nice little grill marks you get on your grilled steak, if you look at them, they've got heterocyclic amines. And in fact, the meat industry has caught on to this, and they're starting to make hamburger with beets in it. And if you eat your meat with some vegetables and fruit, you may be able to counteract these things, which is why I would wonder, Sean, why wouldn't you want to eat like some antioxidants to counteract the AGEs?
Well, I mean, advanced glycation end products, there's endogenous and exogenous ones. By far, the endogenously derived ones are bigger problem, whether it's through fructose, glucose, methyl glyoxal. I mean, there's different mechanisms. Chris Masterjohn had a nice article on that I looked at the other day. And so I'm not so concerned about the exogenous ones. And we have, it's interesting, like these, we hear a lot about like sulforaphane in broccoli sprouts and how it's hormetically beneficial to us and upregulates certain enzymes. It's interesting because the way these HCAs and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are detoxified, they use the same pathway as sulforaphane, and they get the same sort of hormetic stress effects, I think, that they do with that. So, I mean, and you mentioned, most of the data on whether, heterocyclic amines and so on, N-nitroso compounds are bad for us are usually very high dose, done in rodents.
True, Race. Happy Veganstein's Day. True. I'll send you a hat, Race. Happy V Day to everybody in chat. Appreciate you guys.
In doses at most, I'd have to eat a lot of burnt steak, right? To obtain those levels. And so if we look at we're obviously colorectal cancer is a big one with meat. I mean, there's some evidence that prostate and breast, but it's mostly been colorectal cancer. But if you look at the risk factors for colorectal cancer, WHO says 17% relative risk per, I think, 50 grams of meat or something like that. And then you compare that to other risk factors for colorectal cancer: obesity, chronic inflammation, diabetes, particular inflammatory bowel disease, where the relative risk is like 3,000-fold, right? And yet I see people that go carnivore. They're no longer obese. They're no longer diabetic. They no longer are, exhibiting signs of inflammation. Their IBD goes away. To me, it's like your risk has gone down by most of these risk factors. Maybe that's...
I'll say whatever you want, Mace. Just to point out more anecdotes from Sean here.
Other risk factors for colorectal cancer: obesity, chronic inflammation, diabetes, particular inflammatory bowel disease, where the relative risk is like 3,000-fold, right? And yet I see people that go carnivore. They're no longer obese. They're no longer diabetic. They no longer are, exhibiting signs of inflammation. Their IBD goes away.
If he had evidence, this is the main thing, like when people are bringing up the anecdotal stuff, right? That looking to make a particular claim, if he had evidence from long-term, well-controlled, well-designed health studies that there is low risk of these health outcomes associated with the carnivore diet, he would cite that evidence. So the fact they're saying, well, I see people for whom this happens, we can probably infer that he doesn't have any good evidence for it. And that's why he's talking about the anecdotes.
To me, it's like your risk has gone down by most of these risk factors. Maybe that 17% that the WHO put out there is, what's the net effect of that? So what is the net effect? And I don't know. I'm just like, I don't know. I suspect that getting rid of Crohn's disease is going to protect you from colorectal cancer more so than not eating meat, in my view. But it's, again, as you know, mechanistic things are, you can't rely on those in isolation because there's lots of mechanisms going on. And you might have a negative mechanistic thing, but you might have a positive mechanistic thing.
Yeah, it's like I mentioned earlier, it all goes into like a bigger picture. Like, let's take prostate cancer. We've got a mechanism for prostate cancer.
Right.
If you look at acromegaly, so people that have acromegaly, really high IGF-1, they have a very high rate of having prostate cancer. And so does IGF-1 cause prostate cancer? Well, if you look at the health profession study out of Harvard, the people that ate the most dairy.
Yeah, no, you're right, Race. I think there's a decent amount of epidemiological evidence of higher meat consumption associated with a higher risk of diabetes. So, again, yeah, something where another debater might have pushed back harder. Now, often when I see stuff like this, I'm tempted to say there's kind of a selection effect where these like quite well-known advocates like Sean Baker are maybe selecting for people who they know are going to go kind of easy in a debate. And you can do that if you're quite well known, right? Because you don't have to debate every Tom, Dick, and Harry that comes along. You can be a bit selective. You have plenty of opportunities for people to have a conversation with. So I would be tempted to say that he's just like using that and only debating people he knows going to go kind of easy. But we did watch the Milton vegan debate the other day. So maybe not. That is not someone who's going to go easy.
And dairy is a strong promoter of IGF-1. They had the highest amount. Dairy was very strongly correlated with prostate cancer. Now, again, we don't have causation. We've got correlation, and we've got a mechanistic study. Then we could do a randomized controlled trial. And so Dean Ornish did a randomized controlled trial where he took a group of people with Gleason 4 prostate cancer. It's an early stage prostate cancer. PSA, I think, was 7. Put one on a normal diet where they were eating meat. The other group went on a vegan diet. Criticism of the study is they also did meditation and yoga and stuff like that. I don't know what mechanism that is for decreasing PSA. But what you saw in the plant-based group.
True race, wrecked. You can debate Tom and Harry, but you can't debate Dick since he'd just be talking to himself. True and based.
There was a very strong decrease in PSA and a very strong drop in IGF-1. And so now you've got a mechanistic study, a randomized controlled trial, and a large population study. That's how I can't definitely say causation, but where there's smoke, there's fire.
I'm gonna chime in here really quick with this too. So to keep the conversation going. So I kind of wanted to just ask some bullet questions because I think a lot of people, we get in the weeds. It's impossible.
It's tough to answer without nuance sometimes. I hate bullet yes or no's.
I know that
it depends in a lot of ways, but anyway.
I know. I like to do just a list of questions here just to kind of help people get an idea of how they can proceed, because it's tough hearing all of this, and then just being like, okay, now what do I do, right? And so, if you're not studying this stuff, it's almost like you just want to throw your hands up and you're like, screw it, I'm just going to eat the burger and I'm just going to eat the fries and I'm going to have a milkshake.
Don't do that.
Whatever.
Don't do that.
I'm tempted to say, I don't know. I'm sure people think of counter examples. I'm tempted to say that an unwillingness to engage in yes/no questions is a sign of like needing to obfuscate. Now, you could give further context. Sometimes you do want to give further context because obviously you can just design a yes/no question to suggest something which isn't true by kind of having a narrow focus. But I feel in most cases you could give the yes/no, give maybe 1 or 2 sentences of context or explanation or nuance. But what people will tend to do if they don't feel that they have a good, compelling answer or an answer they're actually happy to give to a yes/no question, it becomes a ramble fest, and you can just speak for a good 5 minutes, and by the time you've stopped talking, people have forgotten what the question was, forgotten what you were supposed to be talking about anyway. So if there's a question that you're asked and you don't like the honest answer, then yeah, it becomes very easy to like basically dodge.
Most of us say don't do that.
Don't do that.
Yeah,
that's not what we're neither.
Well, that's
neither
great
of us
because that leads into my. And so hearing all of this, and then just being like, okay, now what do I do, right? And so if you're not studying this stuff, it's almost like you just want to throw your hands up and you're like, screw it, I'm just going to eat the burger and I'm just going to eat the fries and I'm going to have a milkshake.
Don't do that.
Whatever.
Don't do that. Most of us say don't do that.
Don't do
right.
that.
Yeah.
That's not what we're neither.
Well, that's
neither
great
of us
because that leads into my first question was, I want to find some common ground here, and what I would ask you, Sean, is do you think that processed food is one of, if not the biggest contributing factors to why people's health has been deteriorating?
Well, I think
yes.
there's a clarification. I mean, ultra processed and processed. I mean, processing can be minor. I mean, cooking is processing for a way. So I mean, ultra processed foods, 5 or more ingredients that you can't find in your kitchen. Normally, it's things that got weird names.
See how flimsy this definition is, and how. Whoops, I was muted. Look how flimsy this definition is, and how like unconnected to any reason to think this has anything to do with health or nutrition. Right, he's mentions three things here for ultra-processed foods.
Minor, I mean, cooking is processing for a way. So, I mean,
here we go.
Ultra-processed foods, 5 or more ingredients.
5 or more ingredients. Why would we think that that means a food is unhealthy? Five or more ingredients. Like, why would we think that means a food is unhealthy? You can have a salad with 6 ingredients, right? You can have any number of things with just all healthy ingredients. So this seems like nonsense, first.
It's ingredients that you can't find in your kitchen normally.
Ingredients that you can't find in your kitchen normally. I don't even know what to say about that. Like, why would we think that being able to find a food in a normal kitchen is an indication that the food's healthy? This is very, very vibes based. There's not even a proposed mechanism for why these particular things would make a food unhealthy. So we've got 5 or more ingredients that you can't find in your kitchen normally. The next one's beauty.
It's, you know, things that got weird names.
Things that have got weird names. Again, it's so vibes based. It's so nothing. It's so like not connected to health outcomes in any plausible way. People say don't eat anything that you can't pronounce. Like, what? If I go to Germany, I won't be able to eat very much at all. Weird names. Like, this is so fucking basic.
Mono and diglycerides and, you know, all these weird ingredients. I think those are problematic, clearly. I know.
Clearly are self-evident, really. If something's got a weird name or more than 5 ingredients, like, that's just fucked, obviously.
There's dietitians out there say there's no bad foods and eat everything in moderation. I vehemently disagree with that. I think there's some terrible foods out there. When you go to the store and there's food that's blue, don't eat it, right? I mean, it's just ridiculous, right?
Blueberries.
So I think that, to my belief, is that is the major issue. It's driving malnutrition. I think even if obesity, in my view, is malnutrition because we're just the wrong nutrition. I think it's driving food addiction. I mean, these.
I guess at the end of defining what might count as ultra-processed foods, but I just wanted to reflect on, like, on the face of it, how dumb the proposition that ultra-processed foods are necessarily unhealthy. 5 or more ingredients that you wouldn't normally find in your kitchen, and ingredients with weird names. We've just had quite a long, quite detailed conversation about the particular physiological drivers and epidemiological studies and different Mendelian randomization and all of this study of what diets constitute healthy foods. But actually what it comes down to is more than 5 ingredients with weird names and things that you wouldn't find in a kitchen normally. And Sean says, clearly this is a problem. Well, why fucking bother with the Mendelian randomization, right? Just see how weird the names are of the ingredients. Is this what it's come to?
I've talked to people that were formerly in that industry as, you know, food chemists, and they tell me,
bro, you're watching an ape that thinking needs to feed like a lion. You're expecting too much from him. Yeah, someone said this the other day when I was watching Sean Baker, like, no, you're giving this guy way too much credit. You're expecting far more sense out of this guy than he's capable of delivering. I think that might be a reasonable analysis at this point.
My job was to make food addictive, and they know how to do it, and they're very successful at it. So I think you have to find a way to stop eating that stuff. And again, a lot of times it requires elimination, full elimination. And, you know, you can't just...
I'll be interested to see if Garth says anything to this. It could probably... I mean, he seems like a little bit on the ultra-processed hype train as well. So maybe not. I mean, he might think it's a case of picking your battles as well, like where you're going to agree or disagree. I don't know. He seems to have engaged like very honestly with what he believes. So we'll see. We'll see what he says.
You can't just moderate a lot. There's food that cannot be moderated for many people, and so you got to avoid that stuff.
So maybe you might say it's less about going full carnivore or going full plant-based. It's far more about actually eating real food that's not ultra.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the case. And like I said, I'm obviously an expert in a carnivore diet. That's what I promote. That's what I know. I've got experience in that. But if somebody wants to go on a better diet, I'm good. Whatever works for you at the end of the day, I'm happy to see people get healthy. It's not my mission to eat as many cows as possible. I'd like to see people be healthy because we have a sick society, mental health as well, and nutrition clearly impacts that as well. And so when we have a sick society, it's just not fun.
Here's an example of something that doesn't meet those criteria that he set out for ultra-processed foods, right? And I guess you would not say this is an ultra-processed food, but here's an example of why this is nothing to infer about healthiness. Shit. One ingredient. Very straightforward name. And if you're buying meat, it's an ingredient that you are probably going to find in your kitchen. Shit. Is that healthy to eat? Simple name, only one ingredient. Eat shit.
Fun. It's not fun to go to the grocery store and see everybody sick. I don't like to see that. I'm sure Garth feels the same way.
Yeah, Garth, how do you feel about that?
I see. I mean, every day I get food logs, right? Thousands and thousands of food logs, and you can't believe what people are eating on a daily basis. I read it and I'm grossed out. I have to like stop and be like, don't be judgmental. They're not where you're coming from. But it's hard because you see what they're eating. And you're just like, where do I even begin with this person? Like, we're having this nice little intricacies about what is the long-term study of sex. And I'm looking at a person who is eating ice cream, potato chips, cheeseburger with fries and a chocolate shake. It's a totally different scenario. And so I'm starting at a totally different standpoint with my patients. What are key processes? Look, and we didn't even get into this. We didn't even get into like the theory on my book was that I think we speak too much about protein. I don't think we speak enough about fiber. We didn't.
Yeah, true. The shitivore diet. Poopnivorous, true, guys.
Really get into fiber. I think people are fiber deficient. We're getting too much protein, not enough fiber. And that drives people to make bad food choices where they choose bacon because they think they need protein, or they avoid an apple because they think it has sugar in it. So I think there's a lot of...
Again, the mod's like, I copped having bacon for lunch. It's really getting ragged on now.
I would say nutritional miseducation, but I do think there's a huge problem with ultra-processed food, with how cheap it is, how it's subsidized, so it's easy to get. I've got families that tell me, hey, look, I got to feed a whole family, and I could do it with a drive-through a lot easier than I could do it at the grocery store.
Let me just say something, Lauren, because the USDA, I don't think the USDA should be in charge of our dietary guidelines, to be honest, because who does the USDA serve? I mean, they serve all these commodities.
They've got mixed servings.
And it's the rice commodity, the wheat commodity, the corn commodity, the sugar commodity, the beef commodity, the egg commodity.
Explain what you mean.
Well,
by
I mean,
that, if you could, please.
Yeah, it's actually healthy either way, Race. As long as you don't put it with more than 5 other ingredients, you should be all good on the shit healthiness.
We talked about the beef checkoff the other, because I actually go to the beef checkoff. I went to them and said, hey, fund some studies. And they said, no, we don't want to fund your studies. We think it's a bad diet. Frustrating to me, because I like, this is information we need. We need this isolated data on meat by itself. And you know, one of the reasons
wait, is that real? The beef checkoff program, the body which is just in charge of promoting meat, refused to fund Sean Baker's study because they said it's a fad diet.
The egg commodity.
Explain what you mean.
Well,
by
I mean,
that, if you could, please.
So we talked about the beef checkoff the other, because I actually go to the beef checkoff. I went to them and said, hey, fund some studies. And they said, no, we don't want to fund your studies. We think it's a fad diet. Frustrating.
I mean, It's coming to something, isn't it? When the beef Chekhov study's like, carnivore diet, get real, bro.
To me, because I like, this is information we need. We need this isolated data on meat by itself. And you know, one of the reasons they say is, well, we can't do a diet that disparages another checkoff. We can't like say chicken, you know, beef is better than chicken. We can't say beef is better than sugar. It's against the rules because the USDA has to represent all of the food producers in the country. And so the dietary guidelines necessarily reflect that. So, and where does most of the wheat go? Where does most of the corn go? It goes into garbage. And so that's why we get these sort of dietitians saying there are no.
It goes into animal food. Is that real? They can't fund studies. Wait, what? Let's hear that again.
A diet that disparages another checkoff. We can't like say chicken, you know, beef is better than chicken. We can't say beef is better than sugar. It's against the rules because the USDA has to represent all of the food producers in the country.
Garth looks a little skeptical of this. That seems like it's gotta be bollocks, right? You'd hope. Some foods are healthier than others. You don't have to. That seems mental. I guess he's only talking about the sort of pseudo-public research funding bodies like Beef Checkoff and so on. But that seems mental. Big if true. I wonder what Garth's going to say about that. At least nobody's going to be able to get a study funded disparaging the shit-only diet. The big shit lobby is going to be out in force. No studies which disparage the shit diet.
And so the dietary guidelines necessarily reflect that. So, and where does most of the wheat go? Where does most of the corn go? It goes into garbage. And so that's why we get these sort of dietitians saying there are no bad foods. Eat this crap food in moderation, which I think is literally friggin' killing people. It's crazy the way this stuff works. Yeah.
And I would agree with that. I can't stand the eat in moderation.
Appreciate you, Race. Thanks for being here, dude. Catch you next time.
That there's some guys on social media, and they don't look very healthy. I mean, at least Sean and I can look like we're walking our talk. They don't, and they're just like, meet the patient where they're at. Well, the patient's at absolute crap. The patient's, you know, at a drive-through, and that's where I'm supposed to meet them. So I definitely agree with that.
So it goes back to that whole argument of like, is the food industry, whether it's for plant-based or animal-based, whatever, is it bought and owned? To a certain degree, right now, we're kind of agreeing that maybe the USDA, which provides a lot of these guidelines, might be in
well, I mean, it's
ways.
corporate capture. Yeah, go ahead.
It's more, it is, but it's also, you got to understand, we have a very huge farm bill, right? And the farm bill's coming up pretty soon. And that farm bill is like any other bill that goes before Congress, has tons and tons of lobbying involved with it. And when you look at the money and where it goes, so the dietary guidelines tell you eat protein, lean sources of protein. They have their plate, right? So a quarter of it's protein, a quarter of it's grains, a quarter of it's fruit, a quarter of it's vegetables. So you would then think that the farm bill would spend a quarter on fruits, a quarter on grains, a quarter on vegetables, a quarter on protein. And it's nothing like that at all. In fact, fruit and vegetables, the things I really want people eating, it gets maybe 4% of that funding. 30% of the funding goes to the food that then goes to feed the animals. And again, it's the food that goes to feed the animals that I don't think is the animals you want to eat, Sean. These are the grain-fed animals. And so they're eating the cheap grains, the soys, the things like that. And so most of it, like Sean was alluding to, the Farm Bill is trying to fund the dairy producers, but also the feed producers that feed the dairy cows. And so most of the funding doesn't go anywhere near the unprocessed foods that we're looking for, or the more natural
we
foods.
can agree regardless of what side we're on, right? Plant-based, vegan, or animal-based carnivore, is that the unprocessed or the highly processed foods is the enemy. I think we need to have like kind of a common enemy, honestly, to corral people around. And that's something that I think is really important, because I don't think people get it. I didn't get it, right? I don't study this like you guys. So maybe.
Yeah, I think it's too broad and oversimplification. And yeah, also, I don't know what these guys' association is with actually meat industry funding and so on, but this is known to be a talking point that the meat industry lobby supports. Mainly aimed at plant-based meat alternatives, which again, healthier than meat. Garth's talking about processed foods being unhealthy kind of broadly. There's not been anything brought up about plant-based meat here, which is interesting to note. I wonder if that was brought up, how that part of the conversation would go, because I think the trick with respect to ultra-processed foods is to keep the conversation as broad as possible, and that's how you get this kind of thing, where we get to talk about ultra-processed foods broadly being unhealthy, with the strong implication that we're talking about meat alternatives, even though they're making up 0.2% of the calories in this particular study. So, which, by the way, I think I'm thinking I could think of another study. All right, never mind.
We all got it. Like I study it, but I don't know every last little thing like you guys do in the way
Did a Sean Baker
that you do. So to the general public, it's like, oh, carnivore is going to solve everything. Oh, plant-based is going to solve everything. It's like, well, really what's going to solve everything is eating real food. That's really the baseline start. And then we can kind of navigate from there. Would you guys agree with that?
Well, I would say that, I mean, it sort of makes me sad when I see physicians on social media saying that ultra-processed foods are the way of the future. There's nothing we can do about it. You might as well accept it, and we'll make better ultra-processed food. Because the point of ultra-processed food, in my view, is to make it addictive and cheap as possible. I mean, that's what the company's bottom line is. And so if you're going to rely on ultra-processed food to provide better nourishment for us, I think we're going to be in for a big disappointment with that. So I do think as many physicians that care about this stuff should be saying, yeah, this is probably public enemy number one. We should, because you think about it, in 1954, we peaked in our smoking. I think 45% of the population was smokers. It's now down to 14%. So we can do this. I mean, we have the mechanism in place, either through government with corporate cooperation, to make these type of sweeping, dramatic population health changes and lifestyle changes, because we've been successful with smoking. So there's no reason we can't do it. It's just that obviously there's a lot of money involved. And when 95% of the people sitting on the U.S. dietary guidelines have industry funding ties, that's a real problem.
Is fiber necessary?
Necessary for what?
Right.
Like necessary,
well,
like
kind
you'll
of,
die without it?
I'm going to just share like perspective. That's a great question. I'm going to share kind of what I think most people, how they think of it, at least from my.
Yeah, he's asking the right question. It's what we were listening to yesterday, or reading about yesterday. The claim that fiber is not necessary, or is not an essential nutrient, right, is using this very narrow definition where humans can't synthesize it. There's going to be a specific deficiency disease from not having it. Fiber does not meet that narrow definition, but if you have low fiber consumption, you are at increased risk of early mortality, CVD, and so on. And so, yeah, Garth's asking exactly the right question there. What do we mean by necessary?
My perspective is like, it's almost, I don't think the idea is that you're going to die without fiber, but you need fiber to be healthy. So without fiber, you are unhealthy. With fiber, you are healthy. That's when I was growing up. That was my mom's belief. That was what I ate. You have a high fiber cereal, high fiber diet, whatever. That's going to make you have more bowel movements. That's going to make you be healthier long-term and short-term. So I think overall in the carnivore animal based space, they kind of say that fiber from plants is not necessary, from what a lot of people I've heard. Now, I'm curious though what you guys both think. So, Sean, if you want to kind of enlighten, like share more about what the space believes
Sure.
on that.
Well, I mean, I can't speak for everybody. I can speak to what I believe. I mean, clearly fiber is not essential for life, or I would have passed away long ago. So it's clearly not essential in the terms that I would describe essential. Like, protein is essential. If you don't have no protein, you die, right? But it's conditionally beneficial. I don't discount that at all. I think that often fiber consumption is a marker of diet quality, as Garth alluded to, this plant-based dietary index. And so if you're eating more fruits and vegetables.
I have the feeling that so many of Sean's responses are like much more measured than things that he might say on his podcast on his own. Where I'm sure it's like only a carnivore audience is going to let loose on, fiber's a load of bollocks and it's not an essential nutrient and so on. But he knows that he's got another doctor sitting opposite. And so he's saying, well, yes, it's very beneficial and there's health benefits and so on. So Lauren's definition was a little bit weird. What do we mean by necessary? Well, necessary to be healthy. Again, I mean, you could ask, what do you mean by healthy, I guess. Yes, consuming fiber is going to reduce your risk of CVD and early mortality. So in that sense, yes. I don't know what else to say about that.
You're probably not eating as many cakes and cookies. And I think that's probably where a lot of the benefit is coming from, just what it is replacing. Does it have some, individual, does it provide some sense of satiety? Probably so for some people. Does it limit glucose excursions? An apple versus apple juice? Yes, probably so. So I think there's certainly conditional reasons why fiber, if you're eating a mixed omnivorous diet, I think you should probably eat a little more fiber than obviously junk food. What about my population? Again, I'm interested in a very specific subset of people. And what I see, and there's a few studies out there showing. I mean, one, a study by Tommy Wood, and I think maybe I added there, Tommy Wood and Lucy Mailer, metabolic flexibility of the gut. Because we hear so much about fiber and its ability to produce short chain fatty acids, particularly things like butyrate. Well, it turns out that protein can do it, that, being in a low carb state, you have butyrate floating around anyway, and it provides a similar benefit. So I think some of those things you don't need fiber for those things necessarily. I think that fiber has been shown to lower cholesterol. And again, this is, obviously Garth and I disagree somewhat on the value of doing that, but I mean, there are certain clear benefits to having fiber in the diet. Is it necessary? Does it apply equally to all populations? I would say I don't think that it does, or I'm inclined to believe that it doesn't. I see people that, again, I'm interested. I'm not so much interested in healthy people. I'm interested in sick people. And when I get somebody that's got RA or Crohn's disease, there was a study that came out. I don't know. That's one on Prevotella. I mean, there's one on high fiber diet. High fiber diet exacerbates Prevotella copri. I'm one of the species of, it's a weird microbiome. The microbiome stuff is so in its infancy. We don't really know what it does, but there is some indications in some people that more fiber actually makes conditions worse. And so when I see those people and they reduce the fiber, or even sometimes to none, they get better. One, it tells me, well, it's not necessary. And two, it is conditionally beneficial to lower that. But I think in the general omnivorous population that maybe Garth is going to talk about, fiber has clearly been shown to be beneficial. I don't doubt that. But I think there are, when we're comparing apples to oranges, and we've only studied apples and we've got very little data on the oranges, again, I will concede there is not a lot of studies on carnivore and these types of diets. That's why I wanted to get them done, because, I see a signal clinically every day that there are some benefits to maybe reducing fiber in some cases.
This is another thing that a lot of the meatheads do, going to subpopulations and talking about benefits for certain subpopulations which are not representative of the whole population, and I want to say ignoring or going against, in many cases, the recommendations that would apply to a general population. We saw this a lot in the AHDB discourse around the red meat report, where all of the defenders wanted to say, well, what about teenage girls who are at risk of anemia, iron deficiency anemia? It's like, okay, what about the general population, right? In most cases, we're going to have to see, and again, this is relevant because we're talking about overall levels of consumption, which a body like the AHDB does not want to say that we need to reduce overall red meat consumption, when clearly that is the case, right? We have like over 30% overweight or obese in the UK. But they don't want to talk about it at the aggregate level, so they're going to say, well, there's particular subpopulations like teenage girls at risk of anemia for whom maybe they should be eating more red meat. So it's going to particular subpopulations and moving away from the aggregate picture when the conclusion is like, yes, on average, for the median person, you should be eating less red meat, or in this case, you should be eating more fiber. So yeah, it's an easy way to obfuscate when you don't like the answer.
Fiber, I think, may be the most important.
But I mean, it's kind of funny, Garth, that you said, because we can't even
really
digest it, man. I mean, it's like it's the most important food that we can't even digest, right?
But see, that's the point.
Okay. Well, Garth's going to reckon on this.
I mean, it's like it's the most important food that we can't even digest, right?
But see, that's the point. So that's what I was getting to. We can't digest because maybe our most important organ is our microbiome. I'm starting to really fall for the microbiome. Now, we're in our infancy stages of microbiome. We've got an expert at Methodist that I'm working with to do some more studies on this. Probably the world's expert on this is Andrew Reynolds and the World Health Organization asked Reynolds to do a...
That's another pretty cheap trick, right? Oh, we can't even digest it. You want your listeners to think, well, therefore it's completely irrelevant. But he's not saying it doesn't play any role in dietary health, right?
Series of meta-analysis and systematic reviews on fiber and diet, and he did several, one looking at colon cancer, one looking at diabetes, one looking at overall health. You could look up Andrew Reynolds and the World Health Organization series and systematic reviews with looking at carbohydrate quality. I mean, his studies, look, the burden, if you're going to say that fiber is not good for you, and you didn't say that, Sean, but if you're going to say that it's not necessary, it's not good for you, you're going to have a huge burden of proof because he's put together some pretty good research. And this is like really like skimming the surface of the research. I think what's interesting, you kind of brought up, if I'm not going to be dogmatic, my dogmatic answer is there are 1,000 studies showing that fiber is absolutely essential for good health. When you look at longevity studies, funny enough, you would think fruit and vegetables, I think the average person would say, if we're going to say what food group is most associated with longevity, people would say fruit and vegetables. Actually isn't fruit and vegetables. It's legumes and grains. And it may be legumes and grains simply because of their higher fiber per calorie than it is with fruits and vegetables. And I was kind of shocked by that. That's what really got me started with, oh my God, it must be fiber, because I was a fruit and vegetable person, not a grain and bean person. Now I'm grain and bean person all the way. Now, if you take someone who eats a standard American diet and you put them on my diet, they are going to be extremely uncomfortable. All right. They will blow up like a balloon right from the get-go. And why is that? It's because we're going through different microbiome. Each of us have a different microbiome, almost like a fingerprint. And you can't say it's Prevotella. I mean, there's a general belief that Lactobacillus, Bifidobacter, Akkermansia are good bacteria, and that the Bilophila, Watophila, they got weird names, are the bad bacteria, and Bacteroides, and if you got more Bacteroides, you're sicker. But probably the answer is the variety that you have. And you can build, so there was a study by David et al., which is probably the biggest study, the most talked about study in microbiome, which was a study where they put people on a meat diet and they switched them to a plant-based diet and vice versa, crossover. And they showed that within 2 weeks, we used to think that your microbiome was your thumbprint and you got it from birth. And they showed that you could change it very rapidly. The problem with changing it very rapidly is that you might not be comfortable with that change at the beginning, and it takes time to adapt. So when I'm taking a low fiber person, I don't put them on my diet right away, or I will lose them as a patient. It is a slow, gentle progression, and it's not just fiber, but fermented foods in order to change their microbacteria long term, their microbiome long term. I mean, you mentioned the Dr. Wood paper, which is an interesting paper. Now, keep in mind, this is not a study. This is a basically a what if scenario, and he borrows a bunch of studies, and all of them are rodent studies. So this was a very high rodent study, and I just don't buy rodent study in humans. But it is an interesting concept. Is it possible? Because it's not just that it's not the microbacteria or the microbiome in and of itself. It's not the bacteria that's important. It's what the bacteria produces. So we know that butyrate, for instance, is extremely important fuel for the lining of the colon. And there's been studies showing that if you have lower butyrate, you have more adenomas. And there's studies showing that if you change the diet to lower butyrate, you could get more atypia in cells. And we know that butyrate is anti-inflammatory. Butyrate is this and butyrate is that, right? So we all love butyrate, and we want cells that produce butyrate. What Wood is trying to say is in a ketotic state, the cells of the small intestine can generate isobutyrate, which works like butyrate, and it could sub that in for butyrate. And is that true in a adult population? And my answer to you is the burden of proof is on your side for that. There's no studies on it. If you could prove that, that would be interesting. But the burden of proof goes that way, because the burden of proof right now, the burden of proof is not small for fiber. It's absolutely gigantic.
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as
huge.
Does beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is a circulating ketone in our blood, convert to butyrate? It's 1-hydroxyl molecular weight. That's a very reversible reaction that's been demonstrated, time and time again.
But does it in the intestine?
Yeah, and I'm not, I don't know if they've done that in humans. It sounds like they've done that in animal studies to show that it does, and so we can say, well, it's
right.
probably good. I mean, interesting observations. Most of our microbiome in the intestine is primarily large intestine. I mean, there's some that gets into the small intestine, very little in the stomach. It's primarily, we're talking a large intestine phenomenon. That's where most of the fermentation is occurring. And yet there are people that have colectomies that live long, normal lifespans. They don't even have that. So it's just like, how essential is it if somebody with a colectomy can live to be 80 years of age? And that clearly happens. And so I have to say, I think that the microbiome does impact us. How essential is it? I think that the other thing, again, this is just obviously me relaying many, many anecdotes at this point. I see people with gastrointestinal issues, whether it's IBD or IBS or gastroesophageal reflux disease. And when they go carnivore, they cut out fiber, they get better. And so, my perspective on the microbiome, I think at this point, is saying a healthy person has a healthy microbiome. And I don't, it's hard to put the cart before the horse and say, you need to have this Bacteroides to this Prevotella, blah, 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 to be healthy. I think it's a healthy person, right, by definition, will have a healthy microbiome. And I think that's a fair way that I look at it.
There's so much good information in here. I think it's interesting to listen to the both of you guys talk, because there's a lot that y'all disagree on, obviously, but I do think that to have the both of you in an open conversation, listening to one another and hearing it, there's probably a lot that over time we could figure out just with your.
Well, I mean, I think from my perspective, we need studies. I mean, I think Garth can point, like you said, he can point to 1,000 studies that supports his position. I don't disagree with that.
And I can point to none.
I think he's talking about a different population than I'm trying to represent, and I think we need more studies, and I think that's what I'm trying to do, but it's not easy. I mean, it's hard to get money to get these studies done.
I mean, to the extent that this was a debate, I don't think that the carnivore animal-based position has been represented very well. Or that's maybe not the right way to phrase it. Maybe it has been represented as well as possible. It's just not a very good position. It feels like Arthur's been incredibly polite and, chosen not to push harder in a lot of places where he might have done. seems to have won every point that they've talked about. To the extent that Sean has several times now just saying Garth can point to 1 million studies, and I just think that we need more studies. It's not a very compelling case for the animal-based diet, is it?
I mean, and you're swimming upstream, and even get them through an IRB is tough because you have guys like Chris Gardner. I think it's unethical to do a carnivore study. I'm like, come on, Chris. I mean, there's thousands of people that are doing this. Why don't we study these guys so we can learn something, so we can all, maybe evolve our thought?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I hate to see these carnivore versus vegan camps where my side, your side, when probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle, perhaps, or maybe some people need this and some people need that. I mean, I think that's the more reasonable way to go, in my view.
Right. Yeah, that's I would love to see in the future in some way, shape, or form that we could have that.
Really not much of an attempt to defend the carnivore diet at all. I mean, Garth hasn't said, I think that really the healthiest diet is going to be somewhere between plant-based and animal-based. But that's what Sean's saying, again, without really any pushing from the other side. Like, I think it's just a very weak position, the animal-based diet. He's said here several times there's not any studies to support it or good evidence to support it. He's admitted that Garth has a lot of studies to support his view. Like, the most he can say is, well, we need more studies. And then talk about anecdotes. So, yeah, it's exactly as we encountered yesterday when looking into this on Perplexity. It really is just a lot of extrapolation from anecdotes, no long-term data to support it. Yeah, it's not looking good.
Study.
Well, I guess, because I would honestly like somebody who's in the other camps input into study design that would satisfy them, because obviously the perfect study won't be done. None of us will be satisfied. If you could say, hey, let's have a team of sort of adversaries and say, hey, let's design a study that we can all agree on the protocol and the endpoints and what we measure and how we administer the study, and then let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, I think Garth is saying that's what's largely been done with a lot of the large cohort epidemiological studies, right? He said that they're not done by ideologues. Some of these studies are carried out by vegans and they're biased towards the vegan outcomes. They're just exactly what Sean's describing, right? It's a non-biased research team looking at a large sample over time, letting the chips fall where they may. Like, he is describing the research that has already been done and largely found that plant-based diets are associated with better health outcomes, right?
And I would love to see, in fact, I'm trying to get because I think in this specific population, inflammatory bowel disease, I think carnivore would be superior to a vegan diet. And I'd love to see that study done. I'd love to have some vegan cooperation in inflammatory bowel disease.
In inflammatory bowel disease, have you seen the studies on? Have you seen the vegan studies on inflammatory bowel disease and the?
I haven't. So I mean,
they're pretty.
Well, I think that'd be a good one to do head to head. I know there's been. I just talked to a researcher from
Oh no. Even he's picking a particular outcome that he thinks is going to be good for carnivore and bad for the vegan diet. And Garth says, well, have you seen the studies that have been done on that? They're pretty supportive of a vegan diet. Sean's like, no.
University of Alabama has done it was Mediterranean versus specific carbohydrate diet in, I think it was Crohn's. And it was about a third of the people got better with either. The diets didn't make a difference. But I think a carnivore diet would be superior to either of those studies. But it would be fun to do a vegan versus carnivore now. What do you think, Garth? I think that would be a cool study.
I mean, it'd be fantastic. The vegan, it's kind of interesting. You can't do the vegan diet in an acutely inflamed.
So what do you? So you use an elimination diet. Use an elemental diet.
They're not going to tolerate it then. So you use an elemental diet, and then you get them to remission with meds and everything. And then once they're in remission, that is when. So in Australia, they took a group of people that were in remission with Crohn's, and one group went on a standard diet. Now, standard diet, again, it's not your diet, it's a standard diet. So it could be a straw man, right? It's a terrible diet, it's a standard diet. But the vegan group had no remission in 2 years, whereas the other group had 100% remission of their lack of remission or return to Crohn's.
So this is an interesting
so the vegan group was
perspective because you say you can't dump a vegan.
Wait, which way around? I feel like you changed which way around you said that. The vegan group had no remission, and then Sean starts talking over him. I can't tell what his
standard diet. But the vegan group had no remission in 2 years, whereas the other group had 100% remission of their lack of remission or return to Crohn's.
Lack of remission or return to Crohn's. So is he saying the vegan group has better outcomes here or worse?
So this is an interesting
the vegan group was
perspective because you say you can't.
The vegan group was basically
lack of remission or return to Crohn's.
So this is an interesting
the vegan group was
perspective because you say you can't.
Protected? He's really got Mike cucked in this debate. Garth, you got to get yourself an SM7B, son.
Can't dump a vegan diet in an acutely inflamed Crohn's patient because they'll have problems. And it's my thought that why do I see so many people that don't tolerate vegetables, right? It's like, it doesn't make sense. We've been eating this stuff for there's millions of people around the world that eat this. You know, I think our modern diet has so severely damaged our gut function, our microbiome, our gut permeability to the point that somebody who normally should be able to tolerate blueberries is now not tolerating them. And I think carnivore is very gentle in the gut. I mean, that's my sort of hypothesis here.
No, there's no doubt. Look, there is a lot of vegans, and I don't think they approach vegan the right way. Obviously, they call me and they tell me what they're eating. I'm like, oh my God, you can't eat that way. Or they hear me say that you should eat beans, and therefore they're eating like so many beans, and then they're gassy. They wonder why. And then they go to a carnivore diet and they say they feel better. And so there's a lot of vegans to carnivores. You'll see those all over the place. Likewise, there's carnivores to vegans. So we got them going both ways. But what happens with these inflammatory bowel diseases is you get strictures. And if you're eating a high bulky, high residue diet and it comes across a stricture on Crohn's, you're going to have an effective bowel obstruction. And so that's not going to work very well. So in order to do a plant-based diet for Crohn's, you got to never get to Crohn's in the first place. You got to remember, like our ancient ancestors, you know, they found fossilized poop, which I find fascinating.
Fecalist,
They have found fossilized poop and been able to, evaluate the poop of cavemen. And cavemen were probably eating roughly 100 grams of fiber a day. And so they probably had a completely and utterly different microbiome than we do now. And there's a big reason, like a hardcore, someone who's been vegan a long time, I've been vegan 15 years, and not just vegan, I don't even like the term vegan, a high plant-based diet. You know, I had oatmeal and berries for breakfast. I had whole grain toast with arugula and sprouts for lunch and chickpeas. And so I could eat a ton of beans without feeling even the slightest bit of discomfort. And that's because I've trained my body to eat that way. It takes time to change it, though, and that's why I think you see people go from standard American diet to a vegan diet with full foot on the gas.
Well, I mean, I just comment because I like to add stuff to, because, you know, we talk about the fecalist, but I mean, also there's radioisotopic data showing that we ate a lot of meat as prehistoric people as well. And so maybe could have been we ate both. It could have been one population was eating more fiber than the other.
It depends on what population.
Is that ancestral diet, evolutionary, mechanistic stuff that we were encountering yesterday? Sean obviously feels like it's important to defend, or, well, I can't ascribe too much, but one of the ways of advocating for a carnivore animal-based diet is saying that it's closely aligned with an ancestral diet, which, as we were reading yesterday, there's no reason to think that correlates to the healthiest diet today. But interestingly, Sean felt the need to say, well, no, cavemen were eating a lot of meat. That's obviously a central thing for, at least for his audience.
Yeah, if
are you in the Sahara or are you in the,
you're not going to get too many mangoes probably. Right. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting on that. And I think also depending on the time frame, because nice paper, Mickey Bendor, Rafi Saltoli and others about, you know, human trophic levels, really nice paper. about 80,000 years ago, they think that we started converting more towards a plant-based diet, which, arguably is enough time to adapt. Obviously at some point we were primates in the trees eating lots of fruit, and then climate change led to the drying of the environment, and hominids had to have different strategies. And there were, Australopithecus, boisei, and robustus that tried to go vegan and they went extinct. And Homo sapiens sapien, which we are, ultimately survived. And so it's interesting. I don't have a time machine, but I mean, there's decent evidence that we. So
Australopithecus tried to go vegan?
There are two. There are two species called
vegan
Paranthropus boisei or Paranthropus robustus. There's two of them. They sometimes go by Australopithecus boisei or robustus. And you look at one was called the Nutcracker Man, and they had a really strong, powerful jaws designed to chew through like twigs and whatever to get their nutrition. And they just went extinct because the environment would not support that sort of lifestyle long enough. I guess it just got too cold and dry eventually. So they went extinct, and guys that learned how to hunt kind of survived. So interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of people that have different views, right? They say there's the Australopithecus, but at the same time, there's Homo erectus. Like that, we weren't like one.
Well, they mingled back and forth and interbred. Yeah, we've all got some Neanderthal DNA.
Right?
We've got
some
Denisovan DNA.
Yeah.
You got zero Neanderthal?
I have zero. I got mine checked. I got zero Neanderthal.
Really? I probably have. I've never checked mine. I'm probably like 50% Neanderthal, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I don't know what I am. I haven't been checked.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked to find I had no Neanderthal. But I mean, it is interesting because look, I don't really. We shouldn't be focusing on what our ancestors ate because we have evolved.
Right, I agree with that.
We got to deal with what we got to eat now.
Oh, good. Sean agrees with that. Okay, well, that's good to have on the record. Again, a big part of the advocacy for a carnivore animal-based diet is this idea about ancestral diets, and it's what we evolved eating, which, as we were talking about yesterday, that's not actually important or relevant to what's a healthy diet today. They go into a little bit here, and then Gar says, well, this doesn't actually matter. I'm expecting Sean to say, yeah, it does. This is it's obvious to think that this is aligned with healthiness, but actually Sean's like, yeah, I agree with that. This doesn't fucking matter. So I know this is something that Matt Acton is going to bring up, the ancestral diet stuff. So good to know. Again, I think Sean's probably being a lot more sensible in this conversation where he knows he's got someone to push back on what he's saying than he might be on his own podcast when he's on his own. But yeah, okay, so no defense of the relevance of ancestral diets for modern health from Sean Baker. Good to note.
Yeah, I do think these discussions they're funny. I mean, like you look at Nathaniel Dominy he's at USC now, I think he's at Harvard. He says that our brains evolved because of bulbs and tubers, whereas other people say it's because of hunting tools in order to eat meat. He said we got most of our calories from basically potatoes and onions. Other people say it's from meat. But we can't go back in time and tell who.
No, I agree. We don't have a time machine. I'm just wondering where the potatoes grew in Northern Europe in the winter. I'm just kind of like skeptical of that sort of thing.
Oh no, they grow great. They go great in Russia. They're under the ground. They live.
But anyway, that's again, I agree with Gart. We got to deal with what we got in 2024. We got to deal with the food supply, and what's the best way to do that?
Okay. Well, I think this might be the start of maybe hopefully the two, I hate to say the word tribes, but kind of like working together in a sense to find out some more answers here, because it seems that there's a lot of potential answers in the middle that it would do well for all of us in our communities to keep an open mind and also to understand that we don't understand a lot.
Really, I want you to notice that we haven't heard any kind of concessions like that from Garth. This is really only the animal-based carnivore advocates saying, well, the answer's probably somewhere in the middle. We don't actually know all the answers. Right, we've heard Sean Baker say that he's going to get his bloods done and might sack off the carnivore diet, and that we don't know anything about the long-term outcomes from a carnivore diet, and that there are 1,000 studies on Garth's side and really no studies on his side. We've heard him say that ancestral diets are not relevant to healthiness today. So all of the concessions have come from Sean's side in a situation where Garth is dealing with a self-admittedly biased mod, a lot of mic cucking, and just being able to be spoken over at any point without the mod intervening, and just like chronic politeness, basically, with how he's handling some of Sean's claims. And we've heard all of the concessions from the carnivore side and really no concessions from the vegan side. We've not heard Garth saying, well, there aren't really many long-term studies to support my position. We've not heard Garth saying, I'm going to get blood tests and maybe if they're bad, I'll sack off the veganism. Right, we haven't heard anywhere near the concessions on the one side than the other. And now the mod's going to summarize and say, well, the answer's probably somewhere in the middle and maybe we need to work together and we don't really know. This was very polite, but make no mistake, this was a mogging again for the vegan side. So, yeah, carnivores stay mad.
We're trying to learn and you're allowed to change. I think we forget a lot in science that science is supposed to evolve and you're supposed to learn more. Again,
it's like all the reconciliation, all of the, well, we don't really know, we're learning. We really haven't heard Garth making similar concessions here.
And challenge yourself, and you're supposed to talk with other people who have differing opinions and views from you to know where your blind spots are. And I think that's what we're doing. So just in wrapping, you guys, I'd love to just have everybody know where to find your individual content and information. Garth, why don't we start with you? Where can people find you?
Just Dr. Garth Davis on Instagram, and I do a YouTube, Dr. Garth Davis, where I sometimes put some stuff on there. I'm not the best on social media. I'm on and off.
You got to get a team. I think you have a team, but it's tough. You got to get a team.
I got no team.
Its own job.
It's just me. I got no team. I got a day job, man.
Get the team. They'll do it for you. But yes, okay, awesome. I'll put that link below.
Yeah,
Sean, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm also on Instagram. It's Sean Baker 1967. I've got a Twitter. It's now X Baker MD. I've got a YouTube channel, Sean Baker MD. So those types of places. And Lauren, just to comment on what you said in closing, I agree. I'd like to see more cooperation, but I mean, we're never going to get all the answers. It's always going to be a journey. There's always going to be, every answer you get leads to more questions. So it's a never ending process, but hopefully we can help some people along the way.
Well, this was pretty good. Another total mogging for the vegan side. Lots of concessions from the carnivore side, and confirmation of what we were reading yesterday about the lack of any long-term robust study supporting an animal-based diet as good for human health. So that's pretty good for me to see ahead of my debate with the animal-based diet guy in about a week and a half. I'll probably watch some more of these. Oh, here's that Dr. Chafee that someone was mentioning in chat. Maybe I'll watch this Matthew Nagra debate at some point as well. And there's a couple of others in the suggested that look pretty tasty also.